Farming Humans, American Inequality and Profit Over People in the Age of Oligarchy. Written and narrated by Eric Leo. Chapter 1. Intro. Establishing farm context and expectations. If corporations were farming humans, would you want to have a say in how they were being farmed? What if you were the one being farmed? Would you even want to be farmed by a corporation at all? A lot of people would say no, and even more would deny their concern by acquiescing their power to self-governance. This is wrong and the opposite of the desired mentality in a democracy. What if corporations were farming inhumanely? What if getting involved meant you could have a better life, not just for you, but for everyone? What would it mean to not only have a household, but a solvent one, and a society that actually financially supports and perpetuates your livelihood, well-being, and viability? The goal of this book is to get there collectively. The truth is, corporations are farming you for money, in other words, consumerism, and labor, in other words, employment. You may say, but I live in a free country. However, what you will come to see is what you think is freedom is really an illusion of choice, and you are relatively trapped by the economic conditions that you and your neighbors vote for, which perpetuate through the ignorance from ignoring the subjects of this book. This book will explain the fundamentals of understanding that corporations rule America, why, how they are farming you, and the consequences of that power. You may have civil rights like free speech, but what you probably don't have is economic freedom. And what I will come to show is that this is by design, enacted and perpetuated by the oligarchy to take away your political and economic representation. In this book, you will read about the history of the Federal Reserve, oligarchy in the United States, boomers, fascism, socialism, and solutions to the issues discussed throughout the book. Civilization is like a farm in that it has domesticated humans. It used to be kings and emperors, but today corporations control civilizations around the world by controlling governments and changing laws in their favor. Some don't like their civilization's farm and start their own homestead to get away because they don't like or agree with how society functions. However, this can be seen as a cop-out, especially if you live in a democracy. This is because what you are saying is you want to live scraping by or surviving to create your own little kingdom, ignoring the system because it is unjust, while others continue to be stuck and suffer in that unjust system. This is why nothing changes. What if you put all that work into molding the system? You should change the world. Don't let the world change you. What I will show you is that the country has slowly turned into giving power to corporations, becoming more fascist, and enriching billionaires like kings. It's business over people in the United States, and there is an unrelenting devilish drive for profits to enrich shareholders. These shareholders turn around and lobby the government or outright buy elections to change laws to deregulate their businesses to reap higher profits and further enrich themselves. As I will illuminate, instead of regulating corporations and banks that are exploitative, damaging, and gaming the system, through legislation and court decisions, the United States has enabled the most hedonistic human desires and proclivities of human behavior, usually enunciating oppression through forms of usury, deception, fiat, fractional reserve banking, taxes, inflation, etc. There seems to be a disconnect. Just like how animals on a family farm usually have a better life, having a corporation run the farm loses the humanity of it all. America takes out the human in humanity and replaces it with money. It's profit over people. The American human farm is basically run by a corporation that is like many corporate farms, using industrial techniques to cut costs and raise profits, which results in inhumane harvesting of animals because that makes more money. America is the wealthiest nation ever, but with record inequality. The inequality gap is greater than during the French Revolution. During the boomers' formative years in the 1970s, you could have a house with a white picket fence, a car, a family, and afford a college education on one minimum wage income. Now, nowhere in America can you afford a 2-bedroom apartment on minimum wage. Housing, healthcare, childcare, and education are all unaffordable and have quadrupled while wages have remained stagnant. So how did we get here? Well, let's start at the beginning of the United States. Chapter 2. The Federal Reserve. Boom, bust, fleeced. The control over money has existed for as long as currency itself, with those who wield this power historically known as money changers. By manipulating the money supply, these individuals or institutions could dominate markets, much like any other commodity. A bank, for instance, could control the flow of money, restrict its availability, and thereby decrease its perceived value, enabling those in charge to amass considerable wealth through basic principles of supply and demand. This practice dates back to ancient times and is even referenced in religious texts. In the New Testament, one of the few instances where Jesus is described as becoming openly angry occurs when he turns over the tables of the money changers in the temple. The reason for this outrage was their exploitation of worshipers. At the time, the temple tax had to be paid with a specific currency, the Tyrrhenian half shekel, which the money changers controlled, forcing pilgrims to exchange their money at unfavorable rates. Jesus' act of defiance was a direct condemnation of this economic manipulation within a sacred space, illustrating how deeply entrenched the power of money changers had become in society. Today, the money changers function through a centralized banking system. The history of centralized banking in the United States reflects a recurring tension between federal financial authority and skepticism of private financial power. Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury under President George Washington, championed the creation of the first Bank of the United States in 1791 to establish the post-Revolutionary War economy and assume state debts. Modeling after the Bank of England, it was the nation's first attempt at a central bank, with 80% private ownership and 20% federal ownership. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison vehemently opposed it, arguing it exceeded constitutional limits and favored northern commercial interests over agrarian southern states. Jefferson warned, if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. A sentiment reflecting his broader distrust of concentrated financial power. When the first bank's charter lapsed in 1811, the War of 1812 exposed the need for centralized financial management, leading President James Madison to approve the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. Like its predecessor, it faced fierce opposition, particularly from Andrew Jackson, who vetoed its recharter in 1832, calling it a monster that enriched elites at the public's expense. Jackson's victory marked a 77-year hiatus in centralized banking until the Federal Reserve System's creation in 1913. The Federal Reserve's origins trace to a secret 1910 meeting on Jekyll Island, Georgia, where bankers Paul Warburg and politicians like Senator Nelson Aldrich drafted a plan to prevent future financial panics like the 1907 crisis. After years of debate, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act on December 23, 1913, establishing a hybrid system of 12 regional banks privately owned by member banks, overseen by a federal board. Critics, including later figures like Congressman Lewis McFadden, argued it ceded public monetary policy to private interests. President Woodrow Wilson, who signed the act, later expressed regret. "I am a most unhappy man. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit in the hands of a few men." Contrary to its name, the Federal Reserve operates independently of direct government control, with monetary policy decisions like interest rates made by its open market committee. It creates money through mechanisms such as open market operations, buying treasury securities to inject liquidity, and fractional reserve banking, where banks lend multiples of their deposits. This system has drawn criticism for enabling boom-bust cycles and concentrating power, as noted by economists like Milton Friedman, who blame the Fed for exacerbating the Great Depression. The concurrent 16th Amendment, federal income tax, and the 17th Amendment, direct Senate elections, reflect progressive-era reforms but also fueled suspicions of a centralized financial-political nexus. While the Fed's structure aimed to balance public oversight with banking expertise, its legacy remains contested, embodying the enduring debate over who should control money, a tension as old as the Republic itself. The Federal Reserve does not physically print money in the way most people imagine. That responsibility falls to the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. Instead, the Fed creates money through monetary policy, primarily by purchasing U.S. Treasury bonds and other securities, thereby injecting liquidity into the banking system. When the government needs funds, it issues Treasury bonds, which the Fed can buy with newly created electronic reserves. This process effectively allows the government to borrow money on which it pays interest, ultimately borne by the taxpayer. This system was institutionalized in 1913 with the Federal Reserve Act, coinciding with the ratification of the 16th Amendment, which authorized a permanent federal income tax. Critics argue that these two developments entrenched a cycle of government debt and taxation, shifting financial power towards banking elites. Before the Fed's creation, the U.S. operated under the gold standard, where dollars were redeemable for a fixed amount of gold, a system that theoretically restrained unchecked money creation. Until 1933, Americans could exchange paper currency for gold at institutions like the U.S. Treasury or Federal Reserve banks. Today, money is largely debt-based. Under fractional reserve banking, commercial banks create new money whenever they issue loans, as the loaned amount enters circulation while the original deposit remains available. This means the total money supply expands with debt, a system that requires perpetual growth to avoid collapse. The problem, as some economists note, is that the principal and interest on all loans cannot be repaid with the existing money supply, since the interest money is not created alongside the principal. This dynamic effectively places the economy in a state of dependence on continuous borrowing, reinforcing what critics describe as a form of financial bondage. Quantitative easing, QE, the Fed's large-scale asset purchases. Quantitative easing, the Fed's large-scale asset purchases, further complicates this structure by explaining the central bank's balance sheet without directly increasing circulating currency. While opponents argue these measures stabilize economies, others warn they exacerbate wealth inequality and long-term financial instability. The debate over who truly controls money and at what cost to society remains one of the most enduring and contentious in American economic history. In other words, the U.S. government trades paper bonds for newly created electronic money. This means money is created when you take out a loan, which has to be paid back on interest. This is what is called debt bondage, as you are unable to pay back the principal and interest with just the principal. Since the United States abandoned the gold standard in 1971, the dollar has been a fiat currency. This means it has value only because the government declares it legal tender, not because it is backed by a physical commodity like gold. Without its constraint, the Federal Reserve can expand the money supply at will, leading to inflation, which erodes purchasing power over time. Unlike sound money systems, where currency is tied to a finite resource, fiat systems allow unchecked monetary expansion, benefiting financial elites at the expense of the working class. Usury laws, which cap interest rates on loans, have existed for centuries to prevent predatory lending. Historically, many religions and civilizations, including medieval Christianity and Islam, condemned excessive interest as exploitative. In the U.S., usury laws vary by state, with some setting strict limits on interest rates for consumer loans, credit cards, and mortgages. These regulations exist to protect borrowers from being crushed by debt. Yet, while ordinary citizens are subject to usury laws, the Federal Reserve operates without such constraints. The Fed sets benchmark interest rates, effectively determining the cost of borrowing for the entire economy. When it lowers rates, it encourages debt expansion. When it raises them, it triggers economic contractions. This power allows central banks to manipulate credit cycles, enriching financial institutions that profit from debt while leaving everyday Americans vulnerable to boom and bust instability. Inflation is often dismissed as a natural economic phenomenon, but in reality, it functions as a regressive tax, one that disproportionately harms wage earners while benefiting asset holders. When the Fed creates money through quantitative easing or fractional reserve lending, the new currency dilutes the value of the existing dollars. Wages rarely keep pace with rising prices, so workers lose purchasing power. Meanwhile, the wealthy, who own stocks, real estate, and other hard assets, see their holdings inflate in nominal value, widening wealth inequality. In other words, the money changers took the U.S. government off the gold standard. They issued fiat money, then bought physical assets, and then printed more money, inflating the value of their assets while reducing buying power. Then they trigger an economic contraction or bust. They buy more assets at a discount and then inflate their asset value. Rinse and repeat. The result makes it so every time you have a boom and bust cycle, capitalists buy more assets, essentially fleecing the American public of any real wealth the country creates. In this way, the central banking system thrives on controlled instability. Here's how it works. First, the Fed injects liquidity into the economy by buying treasury bonds, effectively printing money, or lowering interest rates, fueling cheap credit. Second, banks and corporations borrow at near zero rates, buying up real estate, stocks, and commodities. This drives up asset prices, enriching those already holding wealth. Third, eventually, the artificial boom collapses, as in 2008 or 2020, leading to recession. Asset prices crash, but those with the cash reserves, banks, hedge funds, private equity, swoop in to buy depressed assets at fire sale prices. Fourth, repeat the cycle. The Fed then rescues the economy with money printing, restarting the inflation process. Each time, the rich grow richer while the workers see their wages stagnate and savings eroded. This system ensures that real wealth, land, resources, productive enterprise, is gradually consolidated into fewer hands, while the average American is left with depreciating dollars and mounting debt. Just so you know how far this usury deception goes, it's important to understand fractional reserve lending. Fractional reserve banking allows commercial banks to lend out far more money than they actually hold in deposits, effectively creating new money through loans. When a bank issues a $100,000 mortgage while only keeping a fraction, in other words 10%, in reserve, it expands the money supply without producing real economic value. The artificial credit creation fuels inflation, as more dollars chase the same amount of goods and services, driving prices higher over time. Since the Federal Reserve sets reserve requirements and interest rates, it controls this process, enabling banks to profit from debt while society bears the cost of devalued currency. Quantitative easing occurs when the Federal Reserve buys government bonds or other assets, injecting newly created electronic money into the financial system. Unlike traditional lending, quantitative easing bypasses banks entirely, directly increasing the monetary base. The flood of liquidity props up asset prices, stocks, real estate, but does little for Main Street, as wages lag behind rising costs. The Fed justifies quantitative easing as economic stimulus, but in reality, it distorts the markets, artificially inflating wealth for those who own assets while eroding purchasing power for wage earners. Each round of quantitative easing and loose lending sets up the next crisis. Cheap money fuels speculative bubbles, .com, housing, stocks, which eventually bursts when debt becomes unsustainable. The Fed then rescues the economy with even more money printing, bailing out financial elites while ordinary Americans suffer job losses and inflation. This cycle ensures that the wealthy steadily concentrate at the top, as those closest to the money supply, banks, corporations, and the ultra-rich, buy up assets on the cheap during downturns. The result? A rigged system where the working class pays for the boom, the bust, and the inevitable next round of monetary expansion. Since 1913, when the Federal Reserve was established, the dollar has lost over 96% of its purchasing power. Before the Fed, the U.S. adhered inconsistently to the gold standard, which restrained reckless money printing. But once the dollar was fully untethered from gold in 1971, inflation became a permanent feature of the U.S. economy and the boom-bust capitalist wealth accumulation cycle with it. The shift from gold-backed money to fiat currency was not an accident. It was a deliberate move to centralize financial power. Inflation, disguised as economic growth, is really a stealth tax on labor, while those closest to the money creation, banks, Wall Street, and government contractors, reap the rewards. Until monetary policy is reformed, whether by returning to a commodity standard, abolishing fractional reserve banking, or imposing strict usury limits on central banks, the cycle of boom, bust, and wealth extraction will continue. The question remains, who should control money? The people or an unelected banking elite? History shows that when money is centralized, freedom and prosperity are eroded. The solution lies in reclaiming sound money and breaking the Fed's monopoly over the lifeblood of the economy. Chapter 3: Republican Oligarchs, Healthcare, and Small Business. Booms and busts are just the main mechanism by which the money changers maintain and grow their wealth and control. Wealthy capitalists can also game the system and create an unfair advantage. Wealth is the best predictor of success over education and occupation. In this chapter, you will learn about Republicans and economic recession, why the oligarchy is Republican, how MAGA is fascist and Republicans are Nazis, the deathly consequences of inequality, how and why capitalists perpetuate inequality, and how it relates to healthcare, small business, and Luigi Mangiani and the public's attitude. The historical pattern of economic performance under Republican and Democratic presidents reveals a striking trend. Republican administrations consistently lead to recessions and financial instability, while Democratic presidencies foster growth and recovery. This isn't mere coincidence, but the result of fundamentally different policy approaches. Republican strategies, like massive tax cuts for the wealthy, financial deregulation, and disruptive trade wars, create ideal conditions for economic downturns. The Trump tax cuts of 2017 added nearly $2 trillion to the national debt while failing to deliver promised wage growth, and his trade wars cost American farmers billions while triggering recession warnings. Meanwhile, Democratic policies like infrastructure investment, social safety nets, and strategic stimulus packages have repeatedly pulled the economy out of Republican-created crises. President Clinton left office with a budget surplus and 23 million new jobs, while Biden's policies created over 16 million jobs in just 3 years. The pattern is undeniable. 10 of the last 11 recessions began under Republican presidents, while Democratic administrations consistently produced stronger job growth, higher GDP expansion, and lower unemployment. This boom-bust cycle serves a specific purpose. Economic crashes allow wealthy capitalists and financial institutions to buy up assets at fire sale prices, only to see those assets rebound in value under subsequent Democratic leadership. The result is a system where working Americans bear the brunt of Republican-created recessions, while economic elites profit from the volatility. From Reagan's trickle-down failures to Trump's disastrous trade wars, the evidence shows Republican economic policies don't just fail, they actively undermine stability for the benefit of the wealthy few. The solution isn't just alternating between parties, but recognizing that one party's approach consistently produces crises while the other consistently engineers recoveries. Until this fundamental imbalance is addressed, the cycle of Republican-created recessions and Democrat-led recoveries will continue to transfer wealth upward while leaving working families increasingly vulnerable. The alignment of wealthy elites with the Republican Party stems from a convergence of economic interests and ideological principles that have developed over more than a century. Historically, since the Gilded Age of the late 19th century, America's wealthiest individuals and corporate interests have consistently supported political movements advocating for deregulation, lower taxes on capital and high incomes, and reduced government insight of business. This preference intensified after the political realignment of the 1960s, when the Republican Party fully embraced supply-side economics and positioned itself as the standard bearer of corporate interests. From a rational self-interest perspective, wealthy individuals naturally favor policies that maximize their financial advantage. Lower taxes preserve more of their wealth. Deregulation reduces business costs and increases profits, and weakened labor protections suppress wage growth to benefit corporate bottom lines. These policy preferences align perfectly with conservative Republican ideology, which emphasizes limited government intervention in markets and lower taxes as core principles. The wealthy then reinvest portions of their growing fortunes into political influence through campaign donations, super PACs, lobbying efforts, and media ownership, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where money buys political access and favorable policies, which in turn generate more wealth to purchase greater influence. This explains why Republican policies consistently benefit the wealthiest Americans while often harming working-class constituents who vote for them. The party has effectively become the political arm of an oligarchic class that uses it to enrich their economic dominance. The data bears this out. Since 1980, Republican tax policies have overwhelmingly favored the top 1%, while Democratic administrations have typically implemented more progressive taxation. Corporate lobbying expenditures heavily favor Republican candidates, with business interests spending nearly twice as much on GOP campaigns as Democratic ones in recent election cycles. This systematic capture of government by wealth explains why America's inequality gaps widen under Republican leadership and why the party consistently opposes campaign finance reform, minimum wage increases, and stronger financial regulations. Such measures would threaten the very mechanisms that allow the wealthy to maintain their disproportionate influence over the political system. The result is what political scientists describe as a form of oligarchy, where a small economic elite effectively controls the levers of government through their financial power. While both parties receive substantial donations from wealthy interests, the Republican Party has become particularly dependent on and responsive to its ultra-wealthy donor base, often at the expense of its working-class voters. The dynamic creates a feedback loop where Republican policies generate concentrated wealth at the top, which is then deployed to secure more Republican victories and more wealth-concentrating policies. The evidence appears in tax records, wealth inequality data, and policy outcomes. When Republicans control government, the rich get richer faster. Corporations face fewer restrictions, and the mechanisms of democratic accountability weaken. This explains why America's billionaire class overwhelmingly supports Republican candidates and why the party's platform so consistently serves their interests above all others. It's not merely a political preference, but a rational investment strategy for preserving and expanding oligarchic power. Fascism emerged in the early 20th century as a far-right movement characterized by ultranationalism, authoritarianism, suppression of dissent, and the merging of corporate and state power. Historically, fascist regimes like Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany arose from conservative reactions against socialism, liberalism, and democracy, presenting themselves as defenders of traditional values while systematically dismantling democratic institutions. These movements shared core ideological tenets with modern far-right groups. The myth of national decline requiring radical revival, scapegoating of minorities and political opponents, contempt for pluralism, and the glorification of strongman leadership. The MAGA movement embodies these same far-right characteristics through its devotion to Donald Trump as a singular leader figure, its America First nationalist rhetoric mirroring 1930s isolationism, its attacks on the free press as enemies of the people, language directly echoing authoritarian regimes, and its efforts to overturn democratic elections, just as fascist movements historically sought to destroy electoral systems that constrained their power. The ideological parallels between MAGA Republicans and historical fascism extend beyond superficial similarities to foundational principles. Like the Nazis who weaponized nostalgia for a mythic past, make Germany great again, MAGA promotes an imagined golden age of American history that requires purging of un-American elements. Republican policies increasingly mirror fascist tactics, banning books and controlling school curricula, like Nazi book burning, demonizing LGBTQ+ people and racial minorities as threats to social order, reminiscent of Nazi attacks on degenerates, and mobilizing violent paramilitary groups like Proud Boys mirroring brown shirts. Key figures like Steve Bannon openly admire fascist thinkers, while Elon Musk and his recent behavior, from amplifying white nationalist rhetoric to joking about Hitler on social media platforms to doing the Nazi salute, demonstrates how contemporary far-right figures test boundaries of acceptable discourse before revealing reactionary core beliefs, a pattern scholars call stochastic terrorism. When Republican lawmakers refuse to condemn these actions or even emulate them, they validate the comparison to historical fascism. The Nazi label accurately applies to today's Republican Party, not because every conservative is a genocidal extremist, although they are taking away healthcare from trans people, effectively creating a genocide, but because the movement has embraced the same ideological framework that made fascism dangerous. The belief that some citizens are real Americans while others are internal enemies. That democratic norms should yield to the leader's will, that violence is legitimate against political opponents, and that truth itself should be subordinated to power. From Trump's very fine people on both sides' defense of white supremacists to Republican states banning accurate history education about racism, the party exhibits the hallmarks of fascist movements in their early stages. The alarming frequency with which Republican figures flirt with Nazi imagery and rhetoric, whether Musk's Hitler jokes, Bannon's revolutionary posturing, or Marjorie Taylor Greene's comparisons of vaccine policies to the Holocaust, suggest either deliberate strategy or ideological affinity, both of which confirm the fascist characterization. As with historical fascism, the modern far right disguises its authoritarian aims in populist packaging, but the underlying contempt for democracy, diversity, and human equality remains the defining feature of both MAGA and its Nazi predecessors. The United States exhibits clear characteristics of a plutocracy, with Princeton University studies demonstrating that policy outcomes overwhelmingly favor economic elites and organized business interests over the average citizen, effectively making the country function as an oligarchy. Sociologists have begun applying the term techno-feudalism to describe America's modern economic structure, where a small capitalist class controls both wealth and digital infrastructure, while the majority face diminishing economic mobility and increasing dependence on platform-based labor. This inequality has reached historic proportions. America's wealth gap now exceeds that of pre-revolutionary France, with the top 1% controlling more wealth than the entire middle class combined. The tax code serves as a primary driver for this disparity, systematically favoring capital over labor through lower rates on investment income, loopholes for inherited wealth, and repeated regressive tax cuts like those under Bush and Trump that delivered trillions in benefits to corporations and the wealthy. The consequences of inequality extend far beyond abstract economic statistics. They have deadly real-world effects. When wealth and power concentrate in the hands of a few, ordinary people suffer tangible harm. Many struggle to afford basic necessities like food, housing, and healthcare, while others are priced out of education or forced to delay starting families due to financial instability. At the same time, billionaires amass even greater fortunes, widening the chasm between the rich and the working class. The concept of the working poor exemplifies this crisis. Millions of Americans labor full-time, yet still can't earn a living wage, trapped in a system where productivity has surged while pay has stagnated for decades, while the cost of essentials such as housing, healthcare, childcare, and education have skyrocketed, leaving families increasingly burdened. The United States functions as a plutocratic oligarchy, where economic and political power is wielded by the wealthy elite, largely insulated from the struggles of everyday citizens. Nowhere is this disconnect more evident than in healthcare. Unlike other developed nations, the U.S. relies on a privatized system dominated by corporate interests, making it the most expensive in the world while delivering middling outcomes. Pharmaceutical and insurance lobbies exert outsized influence, prioritizing profits over public health. The human cost is staggering. Thousands die each year due to denied coverage claims or lack of access to medical care. These are not mere policy failures. They are direct consequences of systematic inequality. At its core, this system seeks to strip away economic and political representation from the majority, consolidating power within an oligarchy that governs for its own benefit. The result is a society where inequality doesn't just diminish quality of life, it kills. With climate change, the stakes could not be higher. Without meaningful reform, the deadly toll of inequality will only continue to rise. Healthcare in the United States operates as a mechanism of economic control, reinforcing dependency and restricting individual autonomy. Unlike nations with universal healthcare, where medical access is a public right, Americans' privatized system ties survival to employment, ensuring that citizens remain bound to corporate structures. This creates a form of modern despotism, where people must labor not just for livelihood, but for the mere possibility of healthcare, a necessity priced beyond reach for many. The system functions as an invisible caste mechanism. The poor ration care or go untreated, the middle class drown in medical debt, and only the wealthy experience consistent access. By design, this forces individuals into perpetual economic servitude, as losing a job can mean losing life-saving coverage, a risk few can afford. Corporate dominance shapes industries by prioritizing profit maximization, cutting labor and material costs while raising prices. Nowhere is it more evident than in healthcare, where privatization allows corporations to treat medical care as a revenue stream rather than a public good. By maintaining a for-profit system, pharmaceutical companies, insurers, and hospital chains wield disproportionate influence over legislation and pricing, enabling practices like price gouging on essential medications. The result is a system where life-saving treatments remain unaffordable for millions, effectively holding patients hostage to corporate profit motives. The consequences are measurable. The U.S. spends more on healthcare per capita than any other developed nation, yet it ranks far below its peers in outcomes like life expectancy and preventable deaths. Unlike most Western countries, where universal healthcare is the norm, America's system is uniquely privatized, a distinction that benefits corporate lobbies. The pharmaceutical and insurance industries consistently rank among the top spenders in congressional lobbying, ensuring policies favor their financial interests over public health. This reflects a broader oligarchic principle. In America, capital takes precedent over human welfare. When patients ration insulin or forego treatment due to costs, the system functions as intended, prioritizing shareholders' returns over survival. It's money over people. The question is not hypothetical. Thousands die annually from the lack of access to care, making the answer tragically clear. Under corporate rule, those who cannot pay are allowed to perish. Healthcare is just one tool of social control. Other economic conditions similarly constrain freedom. Student debt, for instance, chains young adults to decades of repayment, discouraging career shifts or entrepreneurial risks that might threaten financial stability. Housing insecurity, driven by speculative markets and stagnant wages, forces families into exploitive rental agreements, with eviction looming over any missed payment. Even transportation dependence on car ownership in a country with underfunded public transit traps low-income workers in cycles of debt for repairs, insurance, and fuel. Each of these systems funnels wealth upward while narrowing life choices for the majority. The military-industrial complex exemplifies how corporate interests dictate national policy. War, as a profitable enterprise, sustains an expansive defense sector that operates contrary to the Founding Fathers' vision of avoiding permanent standing armies. Today, the U.S. maintains an imperial network of over 800 foreign bases, spends more on defense than the next 10 nations combined, and allocates roughly half of all discretionary federal funding to the military. This system thrives because defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, and others, lobby aggressively for lucrative contracts, ensuring continued demand for their products. The Iraq War, heavily influenced by corporate and ideological interests under the Bush administration, demonstrated how military intervention serves as both geopolitical strategy and profit engine. America's budget reflects its priorities. While Republicans routinely claim insufficient funds for education, healthcare, or housing, they consistently approve massive military expenditures. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a Republican and former general, famously warned of the dangers posed by an unchecked military-industrial complex. His prescient concerns have only grown more relevant as defense budgets balloon while domestic needs go unmet. Journalist Dan Rather once noted, "Imagine what could have been achieved if the trillions spent on wars like Iraq had instead funded tuition-free college, universal health care, or affordable housing." The choice is not a matter of fiscal capacity, but political will. And too often, corporate interests prevail over public good. The plutocratic oligarchy maintains this control not only through policy, but also by shaping public perception. Corporate media, acting as its mouthpiece, frames healthcare as a personal responsibility rather than a collective right, stigmatizing universal systems as impractical or even dangerous. By obscuring the fact that every other wealthy nation provides cheaper, more effective care, the narrative entrenches the status quo. The result is a society where survival is conditional on compliance, a stark illustration of how economic structures dictate behavior, reinforcing inequality while masquerading as freedom. The corporate media perpetuates a pervasive myth that healthcare is a privilege to be earned through labor, not a fundamental human right. This narrative conditions the public to view those without employer-sponsored coverage as lazy freeloaders, reinforcing the idea that survival must be justified by economic productivity. Yet this manufactured moral framework collapses under scrutiny when applied to small business, the backbone of the American economy. Contrary to popular belief, small businesses employ the majority of the U.S. workforce. 53% of private sector workers compared to just 38% employed by large corporations. Over 99% of American businesses are small enterprises, and nearly 95% have fewer than 10 employees. These operations, celebrated as engines of innovation and community prosperity, are systematically disadvantaged by a healthcare model designed for corporate giants. Small businesses lack the bargaining power to secure affordable group insurance rates, leaving many employees to negotiate the exorbitant individual market alone. The result is a cruel paradox. The very workers fueling America's economic vitality are often one medical emergency away from financial ruin, while the wealthy and those entrenched in corporate structures enjoy consistent access to care, insulating them from the instability faced by small business employees and entrepreneurs. This disparity exposes healthcare not as a meritocratic reward, but as a tool of class stratification, one that privileges concentrated capital over individual need. The system's hypocrisy is laid bare when the same rhetoric vilifying the unemployed for mooching ignores how structurally impossible affordable healthcare becomes for the majority of workers outside corporate oligarchy. The dysfunction runs deeper still. Massive employers like Walmart, the nation's largest private employer, systematically underpay workers while structuring benefits to shift healthcare costs onto taxpayers through Medicaid. This corporate welfare amounts to a public subsidy for profitable companies, with ordinary citizens footing the bill for billion-dollar enterprises making record profits. The hypocrisy becomes even more glaring when examining corporate accounting, where healthcare appears to be a major expense line item. Proving these same companies that lobby against universal healthcare privately acknowledge its unsustainable costs. Rather than a free market ideal, America's healthcare system has become a rigged scheme where workers and small businesses bear the risk while corporate giants exploit public systems and reap the rewards. The United States maintains the world's most expensive healthcare system precisely because it prioritizes profit over efficiency and patient outcomes. Three structural flaws drive this crisis: perverse financial incentives that reward procedures over prevention, unchecked price gouging by pharmaceutical and medical corporations, and the fundamental market failure of treating healthcare as a commodity rather than a public good. Unlike other developed nations that negotiate fair prices based on actual costs, America's profit-driven system exploits inelastic demand, knowing people will pay any price when faced with mortal necessity. This economic reality proves healthcare cannot function as a normal market good. It must be recognized as a fundamental human right. Yet currently, real access remains a privilege reserved for only the wealthy or those with employer sponsorship, an unsustainable model that harms both public health and economic productivity. Transitioning to a single-payer system would actually reduce per capita costs while guaranteeing universal coverage, as demonstrated by every other industrialized nation. These systems achieve better health outcomes at roughly half America's current expenditure by eliminating administrative waste and leveraging collective bargaining power. The primary obstacle isn't feasibility, but political ideology. Specifically, Republican opposition that has blocked Medicare expansion, sabotaged the Affordable Care Act, and rejected cost control measures like drug price negotiations. This obstruction mirrors their pattern of triggering economic recessions through austerity politics and tax cuts for the wealthy. The consequences are measurable. American workers lose $260 billion annually in productivity due to preventable health conditions, while Japan's culturally accepted workplace naps, seen as performance enhancing, highlight how healthcare policy shapes economic behavior. America's brutal individualism violates basic physiology, denying rest, preventative care, and medical security, while paradoxically weakening the workforce. By tying survival to employment and wealth, the system actively undermines the Declaration of Independence promise of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, leaving citizens most vulnerable when facing health crises. America's healthcare crisis stems from a fundamental conflict of interest. The very corporations that profit from the system are allowed to shape its laws through lobbying. This would be as absurd as allowing private firefighting companies to lobby against public fire departments. Yet this is precisely what occurs in healthcare, where insurers, pharmaceutical firms, and hospital chains spend billions to block reforms that would threaten their profits. What should be a public good, funded and regulated in the interest of all citizens, has instead become a profit-driven industry that writes its own rules. The solution is straightforward yet politically challenging. Ban corporate lobbying in healthcare policy altogether. After Congress passes healthcare legislation, a mandatory cooling off period should prevent industry lobbyists from influencing amendments or implementation. The tragic irony, of course, is that enacting such a law would require overcoming the very lobbying power it seeks to eliminate. A self-perpetuating cycle where corporate interests maintain their grip on policymakers while public awareness remains dangerously low. The systematic corruption explains why America, alone among wealthy nations, treats healthcare as a commodity rather than a right, sacrificing public health for private corporate capitalist gain. Adam Smith's concept of the invisible hand suggested that individuals pursuing self-interest in free markets inadvertently benefit society through efficient resource allocation, as if guided by an unseen force. While this theory assumed perfect competition, rational actors, and equal access to information, America's current economic model bears little resemblance to Smith's vision. Today's system, dominated by corporate monopolies, regulatory capture, and wealth inequality, functions as a rigged marketplace where the invisible hand is paralyzed by lobbying power and artificial scarcity. Nowhere is this distortion clearer than in healthcare, where inelastic demand meets profit-maximizing corporations. creating a system that charges quadruple per capita what other developed nations pay while delivering worse outcomes. Smith himself warned against the concentration of capital and the corrupting influence of merchants on policy, precisely the forces that now prevent America from achieving the efficient markets he theorized. The result is an economic paradox. We invoke free market mythology while maintaining a corporate welfare state that would horrify the father of capitalism himself. The trial of Luigi Mangiani, who allegedly assassinated healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, exposes a fundamental hypocrisy in how society aligns culpability for death. If a citizen kills a corporate executive in retaliation for denied medical care, it is branded as murder and terrorism. Yet when the same executive's policies result in thousands of preventable deaths due to claim denials, it is dismissed as good business. This double standard is entrenched in legal and economic systems that protect capital while criminalizing resistance. Consider the disparate treatment of Jordan Neely and Daniel Penny. Neely, a homeless black man, was killed in a subway chokehold by Penny, a Marine veteran who faced minimal consequences. Contrast this with Patrick, an El Paso Walmart shooter whose radically motivated massacre was prosecuted as terrorism. Yet the systematic violence of healthcare denial, which kills 45,000 Americans annually, remains unpunished. The state reserves the right to define murder narrowly, excluding structural violence. War casualties are collateral damage. Police killings are justified force. Insurance denials are standard exclusions. And corporate pollution is an externality. Language is weaponized to absolve power. The wealthy don't starve people. They optimize allocations. They don't kill civilians. They maintain order. Death is merely the cost of doing business. But when an individual like Mangiani retaliates using the same instrumental logic, treating human life as expendable in the pursuit of a goal, the system recoils in performative outrage. The charges against him, including terrorism for targeting a single executive, reveal a pervasive hierarchy of value. The life of a CEO warrants federal death penalty pursuit, while the lives lost to racism or corporate policies are statistical footnotes. This asymmetry reflects capitalism's moral scaffolding. Inequality doesn't just redistribute wealth, it redistributes the right to kill with impunity. Mangiani's supporters frame his act as a desperate indictment of a healthcare system that prioritizes profit over survival. Whether one condones his violence or not, his case forces a reckoning. Why is murder legally and culturally unacceptable only when it threatens the ruling class? The answer lies in control of language, blame, and the mechanisms that disguise exploitation as inevitability. Until systemic violence is held at the same standard as individual violence, there will continue to be an apathetic and disconcerted public towards supposedly important rich people. The evidence is undeniable. America's economic and political systems are not broken. They are functioning exactly as designed, serving the interests of a wealthy oligarchy at the expense of the majority. From Republican-engineered recessions that enrich capital while devastating workers, to the fascist undertones of MAGA's authoritarian nationalism, to the lethal consequences of a profit-driven healthcare system, the mechanisms of control are both deliberate and systemic. The case of Luigi Mangiani lays bare the hypocrisy of a legal system that prosecutes individual acts of desperation while excusing the structural violence of corporate greed, where denying health care to thousands is business as usual, but retaliating against its architects is terrorism. This is not merely an economic crisis, but a moral one. The same forces that funnel wealth upward, deregulation, tax cuts for the rich, corporate lobbying, and dismantling of public goods, also erode democracy itself, replacing it with a de facto plutocracy. The result is a society where survival is commodified, dissent is criminalized, and inequality is weaponized. Yet history shows that such systems are not immutable. The New Deal, the Civil Rights Movement, and the victories of labor organizing prove that collective action can dismantle entrenched power, but only when the public recognizes the true nature of the oppression. The path forward demands more than policy tweaks. It requires a fundamental reordering of priorities. Universal health care, progressive taxation, campaign finance reform, and labor empowerment are not radical ideas. They are the baseline for a functioning democracy. The alternative is the continued descent into oligarchy, where life expectancy falls, despair rises, and the ruling class tightens its grip. The choice is stark. Either we confront the machinery of inequality head-on, or we resign ourselves to its grinding violence. The stakes are not just economic, but existential. Because in a system that treats death as a cost of doing business, the ultimate cost is our humanity itself. Chapter 4. Okay, Boomer. Housing and the Economic Model. Like the manipulated animals in Orwell's Animal Farm, American workers have been conditioned to accept a gradual erosion of their economic security. Each policy shift and market adjustment so incremental that the broader theft remains obscured. The pigs, in this analogy, the financial oligarchy and corporate elites, have rewritten the rules of prosperity, transforming housing from a basic right into an unattainable luxury, wages from means of living into a mechanism of servitude, and growth from an economic goal into an ecological death warrant. Meanwhile, the horse, the boomer generation, insists the solution is simply to work harder, blind to the fact that the ladder they climbed has been pulled up behind them. What was once a nation of homeowners has developed into a renter's dystopia where a full-time minimum wage worker cannot afford a modest apartment in any state. Median home prices have more than doubled in real terms since the 1970s, and Wall Street speculators treat shelter as a casino chip. The same generation that bought houses for 3 times their annual income now watches as their children face prices 6 times higher, with wages stagnant and debt inescapable. This is not accidental inequality, but engineered dispossession. A wealth transfer executed through zoning laws, corporate consolidation, and policy choices that favor capital over labor. The consequences extend beyond housing. The American economy now functions as a machine for extracting value from workers while externalizing the costs, ecological, social, and generational. Boomers, having enjoyed the fruits of robust unions, subsidized education, and stable climate, dismantled those very systems, leaving younger generations to navigate a world of student debt, gig work, and climate chaos. The capitalist growth model they institutionalized, dependent on infinite expansion in a finite world, has reached its logical endpoint: record corporate profits alongside record homelessness, productivity gains that enrich only shareholders, and a consumerist engine that burns the planet to fuel its own collapse. This chapter traces how the rules were rewritten, not through conspiracy, but through the slow, legalized looting of public goods and future stability. It exposes the myth of boomer exceptionalism, the false promise of trickle-down economics, and the grim reality that capitalism, when untethered from democratic control, inevitably consumes the very people it relies on to survive. The pigs have taken over the farm. The question is whether the workers will finally notice before there's nothing left to reclaim. America has undergone a dramatic transformation from a nation of homeowners to one where renting has become the only viable option for most workers. As ownership grows increasingly unattainable, The harsh reality is that nowhere in the country can a full-time minimum wage worker afford a medium 2-bedroom apartment without spending 30% of their income, the federal standard for housing affordability. The housing crisis has reached catastrophic levels, with 2024's median home price soaring to $357,000, while the federal minimum wage remains frozen at $7.25 per hour, unchanged since 2009. Even in states with higher minimum wages like California, $16.50, or Washington, $16.66, workers struggle to afford median rents that now exceed $1,000 per month in most areas. The gulf between buying and renting has widened dramatically between 2020 and 2024. In 2020, the median home price was $295,000, with mortgage rates around $31,000, while rents averaged $1,100 for a 2-bedroom apartment. By 2024, home prices surged to $357,000, with mortgage rates near 6.45%, pushing average monthly payments over $2,200, and rents climbed to $1,300 to $1,500 for a 2-bedroom unit. This makes ownership 38% more expensive than just 4 years ago, while wages have stagnated, effectively locking millions out of the market. Several interconnected factors drive this affordability crisis. Housing prices have grown twice as fast as inflation since the 1970s, when the inflation-adjusted median home price was $180,000 compared to today's $419,000, a 133% increase. Corporate landlords and Wall Street investors now own nearly 20% of single-family homes, treating housing as a speculative asset rather than a basic need, while outbidding families and driving prices higher. Compounding the problem is an artificial scarcity created by a 4.5 million home shortage, restrictive zoning laws, underbuilding, and policies that block affordable housing development. The dramatic shift in housing affordability becomes stark when comparing the 1970s to today. In the 1970s, the median home price was $23,000, about $180,000 today, while the average salary was $10,000, about $80,000 today, meaning a home costs 2.3 times annual income. Even with higher interest rates, 8.5%, mortgages remained manageable at 25% of median income. Today, the median home price is $419,000, and median income is around $75,000. A home costs 4.6 times annual income, with monthly payments consuming 42% of median income compared to 25% in the 1970s. This broken system no longer serves its fundamental purpose of providing shelter, instead functioning as a wealth extraction machine for corporations and investors, leaving generations of workers trapped in a cycle of renting and financial insecurity while the wealthy profit from their hardship. In this way, housing policies have transferred wealth upward, with zoning laws protecting property values, while home ownership becomes increasingly unattainable for younger generations. These systemic advantages allow the capitalist class to consistently capture economic gains. Since 1989, the top 10% have seized 90% of all new wealth, while the bottom 50% saw their net worth decline. Without significant structural reforms addressing tax policy, labor rights, and corporate power, this concentration of wealth and erosion of democratic institutions will continue unchecked. The American economy has reached a breaking point where nearly 60% of citizens now live paycheck to paycheck, unable to build savings or weather financial emergencies. The systemic precarity stems from multiple interlocking failures. Wages that haven't kept pace with productivity since the 1970s, with today's federal minimum wage of $7.25 representing just 27% of the living wage needed for basic family survival in most states. Meanwhile, monetary policy compounds the crisis. Workers must labor not just to sustain themselves, but to service the Federal Reserve's interest rates, effectively transferring wealth from labor to capital. As ordinary Americans face this unprecedented squeeze, corporate profiteering exacerbates the pain, with industries from groceries to pharmaceuticals engaging in well-documented price gouging that drives inflation while delivering record profit margins. The 2020 to 2024 period saw corporate profits surge by 35%, even as real wages declined, demonstrating how modern capitalism prioritizes shareholder returns over human welfare. This isn't merely an economic imbalance, but a moral failure. When businesses can legally extract maximum value from struggling consumers while paying poverty wages, the system has abandoned its social contract in favor of pure financial extraction. The consequences manifest daily: families skipping meals to pay rent, workers holding multiple jobs yet still requiring government assistance, and an entire generation losing faith in the American dream. These aren't temporary hardships, but structural features of an economy that values capital accumulation above human dignity. These aren't temporary hardships, but structural features of an economy that values capital accumulation above human dignity. Thomas Jefferson's prescient warning about economic tyranny has manifested with disturbing accuracy in modern America. The cycle he described, first inflation, eroding purchasing power, then deflation, destroying asset values, perfectly captures our current crisis. Corporate monopolies and financial institutions have systematically stripped wealth from working Americans through precisely these mechanisms, inflating housing and healthcare costs while suppressing wages, then profiting from the resulting distress through predatory lending and asset acquisition. The data confirms Jefferson's darkest prophecy. While corporations report record profits exceeding $2.7 trillion annually, the nation simultaneously experiences record homelessness, with over 650,000 Americans sleeping rough each night. This paradox stems directly from Republican economic policies that have dominated recent decades: tax cuts for wealth hoarding, deregulation of speculative finance, and deliberate underinvestment in public goods. The results are measurable. Since 1980, the top 1% has captured 38% of all wealth growth, while the bottom 50% saw their net worth decline. Jefferson's nightmare of citizens becoming homeless on the land their forefathers conquered now describes millions priced out of home ownership in their own communities as Wall Street turns housing into a speculative commodity. This isn't accidental inequality, but engineered dispossession, where Republican policies systematically transfer wealth upward while dismantling the social safety nets that might cushion the fall. The ultimate irony is that these same corporations now profit from the misery they created. Private equity firms buying distressed properties, prison corporations housing the homeless, and healthcare conglomerates treating poverty-related illnesses. Jefferson understood that economic democracy couldn't survive such concentrated power, and the evidence suggests he was tragically correct. The capitalist system is ultimately undermining its future through its relentless extraction of wealth from working people. By creating economic conditions where raising a family has become prohibitively expensive, the system is producing its own demographic crisis. Fewer workers to sustain future economic growth. Modern couples increasingly find themselves forced to dink dual income, no kids arrangements simply to maintain basic financial stability, as the costs of housing, healthcare, and childcare have skyrocketed while wages remain stagnant. This represents a bitter irony of generational betrayal. Baby boomers, who benefited from affordable homes, living wages, and accessible education, now criticize younger generations for following their own advice to not have kids unless you can afford them. The same generation that climbed the economic ladder on the strength of union jobs and subsidized college tuition then systematically dismantled those pathways to prosperity through policies of austerity, privatization, and financialization. The college degrees they insisted were necessary for success have become a debt trap, with students' loan balances now exceeding $1.7 trillion, while the promised well-paying jobs either disappeared overseas or never materialized. This intergenerational transfer of wealth and opportunity has created a demographic time bomb, with birth rates falling below replacement level as young people rationally choose economic survival over family formation. The system's short-term greed has thus sabotaged its own long-term viability, proving that unfettered capitalism ultimately consumes even the human capital it requires to function. Millennials and Gen Z are rightfully angry at baby boomers for what they see as a generational betrayal, a system rigged in favor of the older generation, followed by policies and cultural shifts that have made it far harder for younger people to achieve the same financial stability, home ownership, and career opportunities that the boomers took for granted. This resentment is deeply rooted in several key areas. When it comes to housing, boomers bought homes for pennies on the dollar. In 1970, the median home price was $23,400, about $180,000 adjusted for inflation, whereas today it's $420,000, 2.3 times higher in real terms. They benefited from government-subsidized mortgages, low interest rates, and favorable policies, yet now oppose new housing construction, enforcing NIMBY zoning laws that restrict supply and drive up prices. Many boomers also became landlords, further squeezing younger generations out of the market. Wages have stagnated for younger workers while boomers reap the rewards of a stronger economy. When boomers entered the workforce, unions were robust and wages kept pace with productivity. Since 1979, productivity has risen 74%, yet wages have only grown 9%. Boomers enjoyed pensions, which have nearly vanished. Only 4% of private sector workers have them today, compared to 60% in 1980. Meanwhile, millennials and Gen Z face 401ks with uncertain returns, entered the job market during the 2008 economic crisis, and now contend with AI-driven instability. Education has become another point of contention. Boomers paid next to nothing for college, just $394 per year, $3,000 adjusted for inflation, in 1970, compared to over $11,000 today. They voted to defund public universities, leading to a 30% drop in state funding per student since 2000. Shifting costs onto tuition. While boomers enjoyed policies that made education affordable, millennials were saddled with non-dischargeable student debt, thanks in part to bankruptcy reforms boomers supported. Retirement security has also been undermined. Social Security, designed as a pay-as-you-go system, is strained by the sheer size of the boomer generation retiring. Yet many oppose rising payroll tax caps for expanding benefits, despite relying on these programs themselves. Politically, boomers dominate, with Congress averaging 58 years old and leaders like Biden and Trump in their late 70s and 80s. They've passed tax cuts that disproportionately benefit the wealthy, ballooned deficits, and often refuse to retire, blocking career advancements for younger workers. Perhaps most damning is their handling of climate change. Boomers knew about the crisis as early as the 1970s. Exxon's own scientists warned of global warming in 1977, yet they delayed action, leaving millennials and Gen Z to face the consequences. Infrastructure spending has dwindled from 4% of GDP in the 1960s to just 2.5%, leaving $2 trillion in needed repairs. Meanwhile, war and unchecked deficits have saddled younger generations with $34 trillion in national debt. The anger stems from the fact that this was avoidable. Boomers didn't just benefit from luck. They changed the rules after securing their own prosperity. They enjoyed strong unions, then weakened them, bought cheap homes, then restricted supply, got affordable education, then defunded it, polluted the planet, then denied the science. Now younger generations are left with unpayable student debt, unaffordable housing, stagnant wages, a dying planet, and a political system that ignores them. The bottom line? Boomers had the easiest economic ride in history, and instead of ensuring the same for their kids, they pulled up the ladder. That's why younger generations are furious. The so-called greatest generation moniker popularized by Tom Brokaw requires serious re-examination in light of historical evidence. While the generation certainly demonstrated remarkable resilience during wartime, their children, the baby boomers, have left a far more problematic legacy. This demographic cohort, born between 1946 and 1964, inherited unprecedented economic advantages and technological innovations only to transform them into instruments of environmental destruction and intergenerational inequity. The very industrial advancements they celebrate, the proliferation of automobiles, expansion of suburban sprawl, and growth of consumer culture, became the foundation for our current climate crisis, with carbon emissions increasing by 300% during their economic prime. Simultaneously, they engineered an economic system that systematically disadvantaged subsequent generations, dismantling the social safety nets and affordable education systems that had enabled their own prosperity while accumulating wealth at unprecedented rates. The data reveals this generational transfer of hardship clearly. Boomers controlled 21% of national wealth at age 35, while millennials held just 3% at the same life stage. Their policy choices, from Reaganomics to financial deregulation, created the conditions for today's student debt crisis, housing unaffordability, and climate emergency. Rather than being the greatest, this generation may be remembered as the most consequential in terms of ecological damage and intergenerational theft. Having benefited from post-war prosperity while leaving younger generations to face the consequences of their short-sighted governance and unrestrained consumption. The true measure of their legacy appears not in self-congratulatory accounts, but in the mounting challenges their children and grandchildren must now face. The fundamental flaw in our economic system lies in its very foundation, an inherently destructive model predicated on perpetual growth that ignores planetary boundaries. The baby boomer generation institutionalized this unsustainable doctrine during their economic and political dominance from the 1980s onward. Their legacy includes establishing an economic paradigm that demands 2% annual growth, an exponential function that mathematically cannot continue indefinitely on a planet with finite resources. This growth imperative, enshrined in Federal Reserve policies and corporate governance, represents a form of economic hubris that prioritizes short-term accumulation over long-term sustainability. The consequences of this infinite growth model manifests in every ecological crisis we face today. Climate change driven by relentless fossil fuel consumption, biodiversity loss from unchecked industrial expansion, and resource depletion accelerated by throwaway consumerism. The system's design ensures wealth flows upward while externalizing environmental costs to future generations, making the boomers' tenure less about being the greatest generation and more about being the most extractive. Their economic policies converted natural capital into financial capital with little regard for regeneration, creating what scientists now recognize as a multiple planetary boundary crisis. The cruel irony is that this growth obsession hasn't even delivered promised prosperity. Since 1970, while GDP has tripled, measures of genuine life satisfaction have stagnated. We now face the paradox of an economic system that must either continue growing or accelerate ecological collapse, or stop growing and face financial collapse, a lose-lose scenario built into the very DNA of the boomer-era economics. It's infinite expansion in a finite world while being too big to fail. Classic boomer. This isn't merely poor planning, but a fundamental philosophical failure. The mistaken belief that infinite expansion is possible within a closed biophysical system that has already shown us the limits of its carrying capacity. Our modern economy is fundamentally structured around relentless consumerism and the perpetual production of goods, creating a system where economic survival is inextricably linked to environmental destruction. This vicious cycle forces workers into a double bind, laboring tirelessly to afford basic necessities while simultaneously fueling an economic engine that degrades the very planetary systems that sustain life. The Republican Boomer political alliance has perfected this exploitative model, demanding ever-increasing productivity from workers to generate wealth for billionaires, all while accelerating ecological collapse through record carbon emissions from mass production and consumption. At the heart of this system lies the inseparable marriage between capitalism and fossil fuels, a union forged during the Industrial Revolution and maintained through decades of coordinated political and financial support. The history of modern capitalism is essentially the history of oil, from the Rockefeller Standard Oil monopoly to today's vertically integrated energy giants. Fossil fuel interests have shaped economic policy, suppressed alternative technologies, and externalized environmental costs to protect profits. This symbiosis manifests in countless ways. Oil companies receiving $7 trillion in global subsidies since 2015, banks financing fossil fuel expansion despite climate pledges, and governments prioritizing GDP growth over ecological limits. The result is an economic doctrine that treats the atmosphere as a free waste dump while measuring success by how efficiently we convert natural resources into disposable products. Our current model doesn't just contribute to global warming, it requires it, having been designed during the age of cheap energy with no accounting for planetary boundaries. Every economic indicator celebrates this destruction. Rising stock prices tied to oil companies, record auto sales despite climate targets, and booming industries built on planned obsolescence. The tragic irony is that this system now threatens its own foundations as climate disruptions begin destabilizing the very economic growth it depends on, revealing the fatal flaw by boomers in building an eternal growth machine on a finite planet. The American dream, the promise that hard work could secure a home, stability, and a better future, has been methodically dismantled, replaced by an economic order that serves only the oligarchy. The pigs, the financiers, corporate titans, and political enablers of the system have rewritten the rules to ensure their own wealth accumulates while the majority struggle under stagnant wages, unaffordable housing, and suffocating debt. The horse, the boomer generation, remains complicit, clinging to the myth of meritocracy even as they pulled the ladder up behind them, leaving younger generations to fight over scraps in an economy rigged against them. What was once a social contract has been exchanged for empire, an engine of financial extraction, military hegemony, and corporate domination. The U.S. economy no longer functions to uplift its citizens, but to feed the insatiable greed of capital, sacrificing workers on the altar of shareholder profits, sacrificing the climate for endless growth, and sacrificing democracy itself to consolidate power in the hands of the few. The data is irrefutable. Wealth has been fueled upward so aggressively that the top 1% now controls more than the bottom 60%, while wages for the majority have flatlined for decades. The military-industrial complex drains trillions from public coffers, bailing out defense contractors while letting infrastructure crumble and healthcare collapse. The housing market, once a pathway to the middle class, has been financialized into a speculative casino, with private equity and corporate landlords turning homes into assets and families into permanent renters. The empire of capital offers no future, only an endless cycle of exploitation. Workers pushed to produce more for less, citizens priced out of basic necessities, and a planet pushed to the brink for quarterly earnings reports. The American dream is dead because it was never meant to coexist with unchecked capitalism. It was sacrificed for an oligarchy that thrives on inequality, a system where the many suffer so the few can hoard unimaginable wealth. Yet history shows that such systems are not eternal. The question is not whether this order will fall, but what will rise in its place. Will it be something fairer, democratically controlled, and sustainable? Or will the pigs, having exhausted all else, simply demand more sacrifice from the horse? The answer depends on whether the people finally wake up to the theft and decide they've had enough. Chapter 5. Corporate Rule, Fascism, and MAGA. The question of who truly governs America finds its definitive answer in the work of sociologist G. William Domhoff, whose decades of research at UC Santa Cruz meticulously document how corporate networks dominate political and economic life. His findings reveal an uncomfortable truth. While America maintains the trappings of democracy, its operational reality is that of a corporate oligarchy, where chief executives and their institutional allies wield disproportionate influence over policy and national priorities. This concentration of power manifests through interconnected channels, from the corporate lobbying apparatus of elite policy organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, which functions as de facto steering committees for America's political economic direction. The legal architecture enabling this system traces back to foundational rulings like Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, 1886, which established corporate personhood, and more recently, Citizens United versus FEC, 2010, which enshrined money as protected political speech. These judicial decisions have created a self-reinforcing cycle where economic power translates directly into political power, which then begets further economic advantages. The data demonstrates this clearly. Corporate lobbying expenditures now exceed $3.7 billion annually, while the wealthiest 0.1% account for 40% of all political contributions. This system doesn't merely allow corporate interests to influence policy. It ensures they effectively write the rules, from tax codes favoring capital over labor to deregulatory measures that externalize environmental and social costs. The consequences manifest in every sector of American life. A healthcare system designed for profitability rather than public health, an energy policy dictated by fossil fuel interests despite climate imperatives, and a tax structure that has seen corporate contributions to federal revenues decline from 32% in 1952 to just 6% today. What emerges is not conspiracy, but structural reality. A nation where legal frameworks and economic incentives systematically concentrate power in the hands of corporate elites, leaving democratic institutions as largely ceremonial channels for ratifying decisions made elsewhere. Until this fundamental imbalance between capital and democracy is addressed, America will continue functioning as what Domhoff's research confirms it to be, a corporate oligarchy with democratic pretenses. The mechanics of lawmaking in America reveal a system where corporate influence dominates democratic representation. Studies show that corporate-backed legislation passes at dramatically higher rates than policies supported by ordinary citizens, a reality documented by researchers like Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page, whose analysis found that economic elites and organized business interests have far greater impact on policy outcomes than average voters. The process follows a predictable pattern. Corporations draft model legislation through organizations like ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, fund sympathetic politicians through campaign donations and PACs, then deploy lobbyists to shepherd those pre-written bills through committees. When public resistance emerges, corporations simply repackage the legislation under different names, running the same playbook election cycle after election cycle until it passes. This corporate capture of governance creates a fundamental imbalance in political power. While ordinary citizens must organize mass movements to achieve even modest reforms, corporate interest can reliably shape policy through institutional channels. The data is stark. When policies favored by the wealthy conflict with those supported by the majority, the wealthy prevail about 90% of the time. This isn't government by the people, but government by spreadsheet, where return on political investment determines which bills move forward. The system operates exactly as George Carlin observed, not as a formal conspiracy, but as a convergence of elite interests where corporate lobbyists, compliant legislators, and captured regulators all benefit from maintaining the status quo. Corporate consolidation has dramatically amplified this dynamic. As industries have concentrated into monopolies and oligopolies, with just 4 companies controlling 85% of meat processing, 3 dominating pharmaceutical distribution, and 2 ruling wireless communications, individual CEOs now wield unprecedented political power. The CEO of BlackRock manages more assets than the GDP of most nations, while Amazon's lobbying budget exceeds that of many small countries' diplomatic corps. This consolidation creates a feedback loop. Corporate concentration begets political influence, which begets further market domination. The result is a government that increasingly resembles a corporate boardroom, where the concerns of shareholders outweigh the needs of citizens, and where democracy itself has become just another market to be cornered. The implications are clear. When corporations write laws, the resulting policies inevitably favor capital over labor, monopoly over competition, and short-term profits over long-term societal health. Until the systematic corruption is addressed through campaign finance reform, antitrust enforcement, and lobbying restrictions, America's legislative process will remain what it has become, a rubber stamp for corporate agendas rather than a voice for the people. The American gun violence epidemic and industrial disasters, like the East Palestine train derailment, are not isolated tragedies, but inevitable consequences of a system that prioritizes corporate profits over human welfare. Scientific research confirms what common sense suggests. The United States' outlier status on mass shootings directly correlates with its uniquely permissive gun laws, which were systematically engineered by firearm manufacturers through their political arm, the National Rifle Association. Peer-reviewed studies in the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery demonstrate that states with weaker gun regulations, experienced significantly higher firearm mortality rates, with guns now surpassing motor vehicles as the leading cause of death for American children. A grim milestone achieved through decades of industry lobbying against basic safety measures like universal background checks and assault weapon bans. The 2023 Norfolk Southern derailment in East Palestine exemplifies this same profit above all logic. Investigative reports from the National Transportation Safety Board reveal that railroad unions had warned for years about deteriorating tracks and the life-saving potential of modern braking systems, while internal documents showed company executives rejecting these upgrades to protect shareholder dividends. This pattern of calculated risk-taking, where corporations weigh potential disaster costs against safety investments, reflects standard industry practice. A 2022 Economic Policy Institute analysis found that certain railroads slashed their workforces by 30% since 2015 while spending $191 billion on stock buybacks, creating precisely the conditions that led to East Palestine's environmental catastrophe. These parallel crises reveal the fundamental mechanics of corporate governance in America. Whether selling weapons or shipping toxic chemicals, executives face perverse incentives to externalize risks onto the public while privatizing gains. The results appear in the data. From the 45,000 annual gun deaths that generate $1.5 billion in firearm industry revenues to the 1,700 train derailments since 2010 that railroad companies treat as acceptable losses, this isn't malfeasance by a few bad actors, but the logical endpoint of shareholder capitalism, where legal obligations to maximize returns systematically override moral obligations to workers, communities, and future generations. Until these structural incentives are reformed through strict liability laws, worker representation on corporate boards, and the dismantling of monopolistic trade groups like the NRA, such disasters will continue occurring not despite corporate governments, but because of it. The concept of a power elite, where financial and political interests merge into a single ruling class, finds concrete proof in the rampant insider trading conducted by members of Congress. Studies from the University of Chicago and Harvard Law demonstrate that congressional stock portfolios consistently outperform the market by 6 to 12% annually, a statistical impossibility without privileged access to non-public information. This systematic corruption has become so institutionalized that commercial apps like Autopilot now allow ordinary investors to automatically mirror the trades of top-performing politicians, effectively monetizing congressional corruption as an investment strategy. The bipartisan nature of this enrichment reveals the true nature of American governance. Whether Republican or Democrat, elected officials routinely leverage their positions on key committees to profit from advanced knowledge of legislation, regulatory changes, and government contracts. Academic research shows that representatives on the House Armed Services Committee average 75% higher returns on defense stocks than other investors, while those on healthcare committees similarly outperform healthcare sector investments. These aren't isolated incidents, but standard practice in a system where the public office has become a vehicle for private wealth accumulation rather than civic service. The Stock Act of 2012, meant to curb these abuses, has proven toothless, with only a handful of violations ever prosecuted despite overwhelming evidence of rampant trading on non-public information. This failure reflects the broader capture of democratic institutions by financial elites, where the lawmakers responsible for policing market abuses are themselves the primary beneficiaries of those same abuses. The result is a governing class that operates under entirely different rules than the citizens they supposedly serve. Legally permitted to profit from crises they often help create, while ordinary Americans bear the consequences of their self-dealing. Until strict bans on congressional stock ownership are implemented with real enforcement teeth, this legalized corruption will continue undermining any pretense of representative democracy. The fundamental principle that money equals speech has reshaped American democracy into a pay-to-play system where political influence is directly tied to financial resources. This transformation stems from the Supreme Court's 1976 Buckley v. Valeo decision, which struck down campaign spending limits as unconstitutional restrictions on free speech. The ruling established that candidates could spend unlimited amounts on their own campaigns and that spending money to influence elections was protected under the First Amendment. The legal framework was further expanded in subsequent decisions like the First National Bank of Boston versus Bellatowi, 1978, which granted corporations political speech rights, and Citizens United versus FEC, 2010, which removed restrictions on independent corporate political expenditures. The political consequences of these rulings have been devastating for democratic representation. Political scientists have documented a direct correlation between campaign spending and electoral success. Candidates who outspend their opponents win approximately 90% of congressional races. This creates a system where corporations and wealthy donors effectively determine which candidates are viable through their financial support, while ordinary citizens are priced out of meaningful participation. The data shows this imbalance clearly. In the 2020 election cycle, the top 1% of donors contributed more than the bottom 99% combined. The economic and political ramifications for average Americans have been profound. As corporate and elite influence over policymaking has increased, workers' wages have stagnated. Real median household income grew just 14% from 1979 to 2019, while productivity increased 60% during the same time period. Simultaneously, research from Princeton and Northwestern universities demonstrates that policy outcomes now align overwhelmingly with the preferences of economic elites and organized interest groups, while the policy preferences of citizens have statistically negligible impact. This legalized system of political monetization has created what Justice Byron White warned of in his Buckley dissent, a mortal danger to democracy itself. By equating money with speech, the Supreme Court has constructed a constitutional framework where wealth translates directly into political power, corporations enjoy greater speech rights than citizens, and economic inequality begets political inequality. The result is a democracy in name only, where elections are increasingly determined not by the will of the people, but by the checkbooks of the powerful. Until this fundamental distortion is addressed through constitutional amendment or court reversal, American democracy will remain what money has made it, a marketplace where influence is sold to the highest bidder. The relationship between worker productivity and wages tells a revealing story about America's economic trajectory. For decades after World War II, productivity gains and worker compensation rose together, reflecting an economic system that shared prosperity with those who created it. But this alignment shattered in the late 1970s, coinciding with the Supreme Court's Buckley versus Valeo decision that unleashed corporate money in politics. Since then, productivity has continued climbing while wages flatlined, creating a growing gap where workers generate more value but see little of the reward. The divergence mirrors a broader democratic decay, where studies show policy outcomes now track closely with the preferences of economic elites, and corporate interests, while ordinary citizens' views have negligible impact. The system operates exactly as designed after Buckley and subsequent rulings like Citizen United. Money flows freely as political speech. Corporations gain outsized influence, and the connection between popular will and policy outcomes weakens. The consequences of this captured system are everywhere. A federal minimum wage frozen at $7.25 for over a decade while living costs soar. Defense budgets expanding to nearly $1 trillion annually as contractors reap profits. The healthcare remaining a for-profit enterprise where insurers and pharmaceutical companies dictate terms. Elections have become marketing contests, where candidates with the deepest pockets dominate airwaves and algorithms, reducing democracy to a pay-to-play system. This reality aligns with what Noam Chomsky described as manufacturing consent, where media, corporations, and political institutions work in concert to shape public perception within narrow boundaries that protect established power. The filters Chomsky identified, from corporate media ownership to elite sourcing of news, ensure the system's inequalities appear natural rather than constructed. What emerges is not democracy, but a form of elite rule disguised as popular governance, where economic might determines political right, and the fiction of equal participation masks profound imbalances in actual power and influence. The graphs don't lie. They simply reveal what the system has become when money speaks louder than people. The historical trajectory of capitalism into fascism follows a well-documented path where corporate power gradually merges with state authority, creating what Mussolini himself accurately termed corporatism. As he said, fascism should be more properly be called corporatism because it is the merger of state power and corporate power. This transformation occurs when economic elites, facing threats of their dominance from democratic movements or economic crisis, abandon democratic norms in favor of authoritarian solutions that protect their interests. The Reagan administration marked a pivotal turning point in the process for America, systematically dismantling regulatory frameworks while transferring unprecedented wealth and power to corporations and the ultra-wealthy through massive tax cuts and financial deregulation. His elimination of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987 removed crucial media accountability measures, allowing corporate-controlled narratives to dominate the airwaves unchallenged, a key precondition for fascist movements. The consequences of these policies have proven both enduring and catastrophic. Reagan's tax cuts for the wealthy exploded income inequality, with the top 1% share of national wealth growing from 25% in 1980 to nearly 40% today, while real wages for workers stagnated. His administration's attack on organized labor, from firing air traffic controllers to stacking the NLRB with corporate-friendly appointees, weakened one of the last institutional counterweights to corporate power. These policies established the blueprint for today's Republican Party, which has evolved from Reagan's corporate-friendly conservatism to overt authoritarianism, complete with Nazi-style rhetoric and symbolism. The direct line runs from Reagan's union-busting and media manipulation to Trump's embrace of political violence and the current Republican mainstreaming of white nationalist ideology. What makes this modern American variant particularly insidious is its retention of capitalist rhetoric while subverting democratic institutions. Corporations no longer need to openly seize power when they can simply purchase political outcomes through lobbying and campaign finance, a system Reagan's judicial appointments helped enshrine. The result is a form of inverted totalitarianism, where economic elites maintain control not through overt dictatorship, but through the managed democracy of corporate media, gerrymandered districts, and voter suppression. As in classic fascist regimes, dissent is framed as unpatriotic. Critics are demonized as enemies, and the state increasingly serves as an enforcement mechanism for corporate interests rather than a check on their excesses. The Nazi salutes at Republican events aren't aberrations, but logical endpoints of a process that began with Reagan's fusion of corporate and state power. Proof that when capitalism's contradictions become unmanageable, the wealthy will abandon democracy before they abandon their privilege. The fundamental flaw in America's economic system stems from its failure to maintain a truly progressive tax structure that could mitigate wealth inequality. The repeated Republican tax cuts under Reagan, Bush, and Trump administrations systematically transferred wealth upward by slashing rates for the highest earners and corporations. Historical precedent shows how ancient societies address similar concentrations of wealth through agrarian reforms. In Republican Rome, the Gracchi brothers implemented land redistribution policies in the 2nd century BCE to break up large estates and provide plots for landless citizens. Similarly, Greek city-states like Athens periodically conducted wealth redistribution through systems like the liturgy, where the rich were required to fund public works. These measures recognized that extreme wealth inequality destabilized societies and that property ownership formed the basis of political participation. Modern America has moved in precisely the opposite direction. The Reagan Revolution began the dismantling of progressive taxation, with the top marginal rate dropping from 70% to 28% during his administration. Subsequent Republican administrations continued this trend, with the Bush tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 disproportionately benefiting the wealthy, and the Trump tax cuts of 2017 further accelerating inequality by delivering 83% of benefits to the top 1% of earners. These policies have coincided with unprecedented corporate consolidation, where entire industries are now dominated by a handful of megacorporations. Just 3 asset management firms now control over $20 trillion in assets, giving them outsized influence over the economy. This concentration of wealth and power mirrors the conditions that prompted agrarian reforms in antiquity, when elites control vast estates while citizens struggled with debt and landlessness. Yet, unlike ancient republics that recognized the dangers of such inequality, America's political system has been captured by the very real interests that benefit from this imbalance, making meaningful reform increasingly difficult to achieve within existing institutions. The American capitalist system has reached a stage of such extreme dysfunction that it actively undermines human well-being while concentrating wealth and power in fewer hands than at any point in modern history. The statistics paint a damning portrait. Nearly all new income flows to the top 1%, while 95% of stocks are owned by just 10% of the population, creating an ownership society where the vast majority have no real stake in economic growth. Our for-profit healthcare system leaves millions bankrupt or uninsured despite spending more per capita than any other nation, and the federal minimum wage hasn't kept pace with inflation for over 50 years, trapping workers in poverty. The tax code, once progressively structured to mitigate inequality, has been gutted through decades of Republican cuts favoring the wealthy, while corporate lobbyists ensure loopholes remain for their clients. This system's destructive tendencies extend beyond economics into nearly every aspect of American life. Our growth at all costs model treats environmental limits as inconveniences rather than boundaries, accelerating climate change and ecological collapse. Corporate influence has so corrupted our democracy that studies show public opinion has near zero impact on policy outcomes compared to business interests. The absurd contradictions abound. We're the world's wealthiest nation, yet can't house our people, with over 500,000 homeless, while empty investment properties sit vacant. Even punishment has been financialized, with private prisons profiting from mass incarceration and prison labor creating perverse incentives to lock up more Americans. Corporate power distorts daily life in countless invisible ways. The tax preparation industry spends millions lobbying to keep the tax code complex, forcing Americans to pay companies like H&R Block for services that could be handled automatically by the IRS. Food corporations engineer hyper-palatable junk food stripped of nutrients like fiber and protein to drive addictive consumption, contributing to obesity rates that have tripled since 1975. Pharmaceutical companies hike life-saving drug prices while spending more on marketing than research. Tech platforms design algorithms to maximize engagement through outrage and misinformation. Banks charge billions in overdraft fees to the poor while receiving government bailouts. At every turn, profit motives are prioritized over human needs, with corporations creating problems only to sell the solutions back to us. This isn't capitalism delivering innovation and efficiency. It's a predatory system extracting value from every human interaction while leaving society poorer, sicker, and more divided in its wake. The modern Republican Party has embraced a distinctively American form of fascism, one that replaces overt racial hierarchy with economic subjugation, transforming citizens into lifelong consumers rather than empowered individuals. This system, governed by corporate interests and enforced through GOP policies, mirrors historical fascism in its dehumanization of people, not as racial inferiors, as in Nazi Germany, but as exploitable economic units. Where Nazi fascism sought to eliminate undesirable populations, American fascism marginalizes those who cannot contribute to corporate profit: the poor, the disabled, and the disadvantaged. The Republican obsession with increasing birth rates is not about nurturing future citizens, but manufacturing new consumers. A captive market to be monetized from infancy through student debt, privatized healthcare, and a low-wage labor pool. This corporate fascist model thrives on keeping the population just educated enough to work, but not enough to question the system. It is no accident that Republican-led states defund public education while promoting charter schools, attack critical thinking as woke indoctrination, and dismantle worker protections to maintain a docile, precarious workforce. The Nazi regime similarly controlled education to produce obedient workers, but where Hitler used propaganda to fuel racial hatred, today's GOP uses corporate media to cultivate economic submission, convincing workers that stagnant wages, unaffordable housing, and for-profit healthcare are inevitable rather than engineered. The core mechanism of American fascism is the corporate takeover of governance, where lobbying and dark money ensure policies prioritize shareholder profits over human welfare. Unlike traditional fascism's outright state tyranny, this system operates through soft coercion, drowning dissent in bureaucracy, debt, and manufactured scarcity. Citizens are conditioned to see themselves as consumers first, fighting for corporate-branded identities, Apple loyalists, Tesla stans, Amazon Prime members, rather than collective class solidarity. Governments worldwide must recognize this threat. When people are reduced to data points in a profit algorithm, democracy becomes a facade. The solution lies not just in policy reform, but in dismantling the entire ideology that treats human life as a commodity to be leveraged rather than a right to be protected. Republicans are bad faith actors in government and media. They manipulate democratic institutions to maintain power, despite representing a shrinking majority of Americans, while protecting and emboldening the capitalist class in the public sphere. The structural advantages they've engineered are stark. While the Senate sits at a 50-50 partisan split, Democratic senators collectively represent nearly 50 million more citizens than their Republican counterparts. This imbalance stems from deliberate tactics like extreme gerrymandering in red states, while blue states adopt nonpartisan redistricting, creating a system where Republican votes carry disproportionate weight. Their power grabs extend beyond districting to judicial appointments, as demonstrated by their blockade of Merrick Garland's Supreme Court nomination in 2016, followed by the rushed confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett just days before the 2020 election. These maneuvers reveal a party more committed to entrenching minority rule than upholding democratic norms. Republican policy positions consistently prioritize corporate interests and ideological extremism over public welfare. On issue after issue, from blocking common sense gun safety measures despite overwhelming public support to denying climate science while taking oil industry donations to opposing healthcare expansions that would cover millions, their legislative record serves wealthy donors rather than constituents. The sole areas of bipartisan agreement reveal America's troubling priorities. Both parties support expanding the punitive carceral state and increasing military budgets while neglecting investments in housing, education, or healthcare. This reflects a national ethos that values punishment over care, control over compassion. The Republican project has increasingly embraced Christian nationalist ideology, using religion as a cudgel to enforce moral conformity while serving oligarchic interests. Donald Trump epitomizes this contradiction, a thrice-married adulterer who became the standard bearer for the religious right, proving their moral posturing was always about power rather than principles. His MAGA base exemplifies Voltaire, who said, "It is difficult to free fools from the chains they revere." Ignorance loves company. This willful ignorance, combined with aggressive voter suppression and institutional manipulation, threatens to transform America from a pluralistic democracy into a theocratic oligarchy where corporate and religious power merge to suppress dissent and maintain minority rule. The tragedy is that many of those most harmed by this agenda remain its most vocal defenders, trapped in an ideological feedback loop that rewards loyalty over critical thought. The Republican Party's political strategy relies heavily on cultivating support among undereducated voters who can be more easily manipulated into voting against their own economic interests. This explains their systematic attacks on public education, from banning books to rewriting history curricula to promote nationalist myths. By diminishing critical thinking skills and intellectual rigor, they create an electorate more susceptible to propaganda, hence their investment in right-wing media ecosystems that substitute conspiracy theories for factual reporting. The GOP weaponizes masculinity, white grievance politics, and authoritarian nostalgia to emotionally manipulate their base, trading policy substance for culture war theatrics. Their fascist playbook becomes clear when examining tactics like the suppression of academic freedom, the vilification of experts, and the creation of parallel information systems designed to construct an alternative reality where facts become malleable and power justifies itself. This manufactured ignorance serves elite interests perfectly. As corporate conglomerates consolidated control over nearly all major media outlets, they transformed news into distraction machinery, keeping citizens focused on partisan theater while obscuring the bipartisan consensus serving capital over labor. The same media monopolies that cheerlead for endless foreign wars also normalize the domestic war on working Americans through austerity politics and union busting. Now, this alliance between economic elites and far-right ideologies has reached its logical conclusion with Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation's blueprint for institutionalizing authoritarian rule. The plan's provisions to replace civil servants with loyalists, weaponize the Justice Department, and gut regulatory agencies reveal the endgame, a corporate dictatorship wearing the fading trappings of democratic governance. The MAGA movement's anti-intellectualism, its contempt for pluralism, and its cult-like devotion to Trump all serve this larger project of disarming democratic resistance while transferring permanent power to oligarchic interests. What makes this movement uniquely dangerous is how seemingly economic domination has merged with political extremism, using the Republican Party as its vehicle to dismantle what remains of American democracy from within. Donald Trump has perfected a political strategy of manufacturing crises only to position himself as their sole solution, a tactic that mirrors authoritarian playbooks throughout history. His approach to immigration exemplifies this pattern. After implementing brutal policies like family separation that created humanitarian disasters at the border, he then framed himself as the decisive leader who could fix the chaos he engineered. The same cycle, repeated with government showdowns, triggered by his own refusal to compromise on border wall funding, only for him to later posture as a deal-maker reopening agencies while claiming credit for payback or furloughed workers. Even his trade wars follow this script, imposing economically destabilizing tariffs before theatrically delaying them and declaring victory. As with all fascist movements, the veneer of crisis-solving masks the systematic looting of democracy itself. Each crisis is staged to reinforce Trump's cult of strongman indispensability. The parallels to Nazi Germany's early tactics are chilling. Just as Hitler scapegoated the Jews as enemies within to justify mass persecution, Trump has demonized immigrants as poisoning the blood of our country, while expanding detention camps and mass deportation plans that recall the Reich's incremental erosion of human rights. His administration's proposal to deport U.S. citizens to foreign black sites like El Salvador's Secot prison, a facility compared to torture camps with 24-hour artificial light and solitary confinement, reveals how fascist logic permeates his policies. Historians note both leaders exploited economic anxiety by redirecting public rage toward dehumanized outsiders, with Trump's rhetoric, animals, vermin, etc., deliberately echoing Nazi propaganda. While Trump's tariffs devastate working-class Americans through higher consumer prices, they serve as another wealth transfer mechanism to the elite. As markets tumble in response to trade wars, billionaires like private equity investors can acquire assets at fire sale prices, a repeat of the 2008 financial crisis playbook where the wealthy profited from economic carnage. Even former supporters like Bill Ackman now warn these policies amount to economic nuclear war. Yet the chaos intentionally creates bargain hunting opportunities for those with capital to spare. His assault on higher education further exposes the authoritarian blueprint. By weaponizing federal research funding, freezing billions from Harvard, Columbia, and other universities, over manufactured controversies about woke ideology, Trump seeks to transform academia into a compliant arm of state propaganda. The arbitrary defunding of programs studying climate change, public health, and social equity mirrors fascist purges of intellectual dissent, with right-wing ideologies like Chris Rufo openly admitting the goal is to induce existential terror in institutions. Princeton's president rightly warns this constitutes a fundamental threat to America's research universities and the very idea of academic freedom. The deadly consequences of political misinformation become tragically clear during the COVID-19 pandemic, when Republican leadership prioritized partisan advantage over public health. While corporate America largely supported vaccination efforts, Trump and his allies spent months downplaying the virus's severity and sowing doubt about mitigation measures, only to reverse course belatedly when the economic toll became undeniable. Even after Trump eventually endorsed vaccination, the damage was done. Analysis of mortality data reveals coronavirus deaths are significantly higher in counties with strong Trump support, demonstrating how politicized disinformation translates directly into body counts. This was not accidental, but a deliberate strategy of narrative control, where maintaining political loyalty took precedence over saving lives. The pattern reflects a broader Republican playbook of manufacturing alternative realities to serve elite interests, whether denying climate science to protect fossil fuel profits or attacking public education to maintain an easily manipulated electorate. These tactics align precisely with the frameworks described in Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent and Edward Bernays' Propaganda, where those in power shape public perception through media manipulation and engineered consensus. The Republican misinformation machine operates on Bernays' principle that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Except where Bernays envisioned this being used for social good, conservatives weaponize it for political control. By attacking objective reality on issues from vaccines to election integrity, they create a populace unable to form coherent moral judgments about policy, leaving them dependent on partisan cues. This explains the paradox of working-class voters supporting tax cuts for billionaires or imposing health cut expansions that would benefit them directly. When laws lack moral legitimacy, whether through racist policies, corporate welfare, or healthcare denial, they invite protests and reform. But when you can first distort the public's understanding of reality itself, you preempt the very possibility of moral outrage. The COVID disinformation campaign proved particularly insidious because it turned public health into a culture war issue, sacrificing hundreds of thousands of lives to maintain political narrative control, the ultimate demonstration of Republican bad faith governance. The fundamental truth remains unchanged throughout American history. Our laws are crafted by the wealthy to maintain control over the working class. Whether examining the pharmaceutical industry's stronghold on healthcare policy, the gun lobby's obstruction of common sense regulation, or big oil's suppression of climate action, the pattern is undeniable. Corporate interests dictate legislation while public welfare takes a back seat. This systematic reality explains why meaningful reform remains elusive despite overwhelming public support. We don't have a government that represents the people, but one that serves capital. The ruling class understands that maintaining this system requires manufacturing consent through sophisticated propaganda that keeps citizens believing in the American dream mythology, precisely because rigorous examination would reveal its hollowness. This is why critical thinking possesses such a threat to established power structures and why accountability mechanisms are systematically dismantled. An ignorant, distracted populace is easier to control. George Carlin's piercing observation that they call it the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it captures this dynamic perfectly. The recent conservative demonization of woke ideology follows the same authoritarian playbook, representing nothing less than a modern-day assault on Enlightenment values of reason, evidence, and scientific inquiry. When Republicans attack wokeness, they're not just opposing progressive politics. They're attempting to discredit the very capacity for critical analysis that might lead citizens to question why. In the world's wealthiest nation, so many struggle to afford basic necessities, while a tiny elite hoards unprecedented wealth. The tactic bears disturbing resemblance to Nazi strategies for marginalizing intellectuals and dissenters, rebranding thoughtful engagement with reality as dangerous radicalism. The assault on wokeness is ultimately an assault on awakening, a desperate attempt to keep Americans sleepwalking through the erosion of their rights, their living standards, and their democracy itself. Just as authoritarian regimes throughout history have feared an educated populace, today's corporate oligarchy understands that widespread political consciousness would spell doom for their extractive economic system. While the Thomas Jefferson quote warning about private banks controlling currency from Chapter 2 may be apocryphal, its prescience is undeniable. The Federal Reserve, America's unelected central bank, operates exactly as Jefferson feared, manipulating the money supply through inflation and deflation to transfer wealth from workers to financiers. Inflation functions as a hidden tax on wages, eroding purchasing power while asset holders profit, while deflation crushes debtors to enrich creditors. This cyclical extraction has turned Americans into economic serfs without their realizing it, a process so gradual that each generation inherits diminished prospects as normal. The mechanism is simple. When money itself is debt, as all Federal Reserve notes are, citizens must labor not just for their livelihood, but to service the compounding interest owed to banking elites, a form of modern indentureship disguised as free market capitalism. History reveals this isn't theoretical, but systematic. The 1910 Jekyll Island conspiracy, where bankers secretly designed the Federal Reserve System, was just the beginning. Later, the General Motors streetcar conspiracy saw automakers and oil companies buy and dismantle urban rail networks to force car dependency, sacrificing public transit for private profit. Today's unwalkable cities and absent high-speed rail aren't accidents, but the legacy of corporate sabotage. These aren't fringe theories, but documented schemes. GM, Firestone, and Standard Oil were convicted in 1949 of monopolizing transit systems, though the damage was irreversible. The same playbook continues with fossil fuel companies blocking climate action and private equity firms turning homes into financial instruments, all sanctioned by policy choices that treat public goods as markets to be captured. The culmination of this agenda is Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation's blueprint for institutionalizing oligarchy under the veneer of conservatism. Though Trump publicly distanced himself during the 2024 campaign, his administration quickly installed its architects in key roles. Russell Vaught, OMB director, to gut civil service protections, Stephen Miller, deputy chief of staff, to implement mass deportations, and Tom Homan, border czar, to revive family separation policies. Their playbook openly advocates dismantling the EPA, criminalizing pornography, banning abortion medications via the Comstock Act, and eliminating the Department of Education, all while centralizing power in the presidency to bypass congressional oversight. This isn't speculation, it's happening. Vaught's Schedule F plan alone would convert 50,000 federal workers into political appointees, creating a patronage system where loyalty trumps expertise. Like the pigs in Animal Farm, the ruling class rewrites the rules incrementally. First came financialization, turning homes and education into debt traps, then decentralization, shipping jobs overseas while crushing unions, and now authoritarianism, Project 2025's vision for a post-constitutional America. The conspiracy was never hidden. It was published in 900 pages by the Heritage Foundation, staffed by Trump allies, and implemented the moment he regained power. Christian nationalism merely provides the moral cover, framing greed as virtue and servitude as freedom. The endgame is clear: a nation where citizens own nothing, rent everything, and remain just educated enough to operate machinery, but too distracted to question why the fruits of their labor flow upward. The tragedy isn't that Jefferson's warning came true. It's that we watched it happen in slow motion and called it progress. The stark contrast between frequent mass protest in other institutionalized nations and America's relative quietude stems not from satisfaction, but engineered precarity. While French workers strike for pension rights and Germans demonstrate against austerity, most Americans can't afford to miss even a single day's wages without risking financial ruin. This is by design. A system where protesting carries existential consequences, where taking to the streets might mean losing health care, housing, or custody of children. The Republican project has systematically criminalized dissent through anti-riot laws in 18 states that redefine peaceful assembly as felonious, while simultaneously dismantling the social safety nets that might empower collective action. The economic vice grips tighter each year. With 60% of Americans living paycheck to paycheck, no universal health care, and the highest incarceration rate in the world, the calculus becomes clear. Protest risks homelessness, and homelessness risks imprisonment in a country where jails have replaced social services. The cruelty compounds. Those who fall into poverty face not just material deprivation, but cultural contempt, blamed for their condition, while billionaires receive tax cuts. Even the rhetorical escape valve, if you don't like it, leave, proves hollow when passport fees exceed a week's wages for minimum wage workers, and no nation will accept impoverished refugees from the world's richest country. Underpinning the system stands the most militarized police force in the democratic world, equipped with surplus military gear and legal impunity. Their mandate is unambiguous: protect capital, not citizens. From the tear gassing of Dakota Access Pipeline protesters to the violent crackdowns on Black Lives Matter demonstrations, state violence reminds Americans that dissent will be met with overwhelming force. The elite remain isolated, their gated communities patrolled by private security, their portfolios diversified across borders, their children exempt from the draft of economic conscription they've imposed on others. When survival depends on daily compliance, revolution becomes a luxury few can afford. This is the essence of modern American fascism, not jackboots in the night, but the silent terror of a paycheck that never quite covers rent, a protest that could cost you your job, and a medical emergency that might bankrupt your family. This system persists because its architects have made resistance tantamount to self-immolation. The evidence presented throughout this book of work paints an inescapable conclusion. America has devolved into corporate oligarchy where democratic institutions serve as mere facades for concentrated economic power. From G. William Domhoff's social research to contemporary data on legislative capture, the mechanisms of control are both observable and systematic. Corporate lobbying, legalized corruption, manufactured consent, and the deliberate erosion of civic capacity. Historical parallels abound from the late Roman Republic's plutocratic decay to Germany's corporate-financed collapse into fascism. What distinguishes modern America is the sophistication of its illusion, maintaining electoral pageantry while insulating policy from popular will, ensuring that whether under Democratic or Republican administrations, outcomes reliably favor capital over labor, extraction over sustainability, and oligarchy over democracy. The consequences manifest in every metric of national health. Stagnate wages amid soaring productivity, preventable deaths from gun violence and treatable illness, environmental catastrophes born of deregulation, and a political system where, as Princeton's Martin Ghislaine demonstrated, economic elites hold 15 times more influence than the median voter. This is not government by consent, but governance by spreadsheet, where human welfare is weighed against quarterly earnings and democracy has been reduced to a brand identity. Until structural reforms dismantle the legal and economic architecture enabling this capture, from citizens united to corporate personhood to the revolving door between regulators and industry, America will remain what decades of research confirms: a nation with democratic forms but oligarchic substance, where the many serve the few under the fiction of popular sovereignty. To change the system, we must first acknowledge it as a default reality, not an accident, but a deliberate structure of power. Only sustained, organized resistance, equal in scale and determination to the force that maintained this oligarchy, can dismantle it. Chapter 6: Socialism, Marx, White Supremacy, and Jesus. This country has socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. Martin Luther King Jr. What you are about to read will expose the fundamental lie at the heart of the American economic system, that hard work leads to prosperity. The truth is far darker. Over the coming chapters, you will see how wealth in America flows not to those who labor, but to those who already control capital, a system meticulously designed to extract value from workers while shielding the wealthy from accountability. You will learn how the term socialism has been weaponized to justify corporate welfare for billionaires while gutting social programs for the working class. You will see how the tax code has been rewritten to favor passive income over wages, ensuring that those who live off investments, not labor, accumulate ever greater fortunes. You will confront the reality that unions have been crushed, wages suppressed, and productivity gains stolen, all while the cost of living skyrockets. This is not accidental. It is the result of a decade-long project by corporate elites and their political allies to reshape America into an oligarchy. They have co-opted Christianity to sanctify greed, dismantled workers' protections under the guise of free markets, and convinced millions to vote against their own interests through fear and propaganda. This book is not just an indictment, it's a call to action. History shows that when workers organize, when citizens demand accountability, and when the exploited refuse to accept their change becomes possible. The path forward is difficult, but the alternative, a nation where the many serve the few, is unthinkable. By the end, you will see the system for what it truly is, and then the choice will be yours, to accept it or fight back. The American oligarchy has perfected the art of manipulating public opinion to serve its interests, using fear-mongering about socialism as a key strategy to justify tax cuts for the wealthy and the dismantling of social safety nets. Through decades of coordinated propaganda, spearheaded by right-wing media like Fox News, they've successfully redefined socialism in the public imagination as nothing more than handouts to the poor, a deliberate distortion of its actual meaning. In reality, socialism at its core is about worker control over production and equitable distribution of resources, principles that directly threaten the oligarchy's grip on power. By twisting the term into a scare word, elites have convinced working-class Americans to vote against their own economic interests, blaming marginalized groups for societal problems while quietly transferring wealth upward. The linguistic manipulation follows a clear pattern. First, co-opt the term socialism to mean its opposite, then weaponize it to stoke resentment. When politicians and pundits scream socialism at policies like universal health care or fair wages, they're not engaging in good faith debate. They're deploying a rhetorical smokescreen to protect the status quo. The irony is glaring. The U.S. already embraces socialism for the rich in the form of corporate bailouts, subsidies, and tax loopholes, while condemning it as tyranny when proposed for workers. The oligarchy depends on this double standard, knowing that if Americans understood socialism's true definition, workers owning the value they create, they might question why they have so little say in their own labor. The success of this propaganda is evident in how effectively the wealthy have shifted the tax burden onto the working class while slashing their own contributions. Since Reagan, top marginal tax rates have plummeted, corporate tax rates have dwindled, and social programs have been gutted, all under the guise of fighting socialism. Meanwhile, real wages stagnate, unions weaken, and productivity gains flow almost exclusively to shareholders. The oligarchy's greatest trick hasn't been hoarding wealth, it's been convincing those they exploit that liberation would be oppression. As Noam Chomsky observed, when you control the narrative, you don't need to ban dissent. You can just ensure it's misunderstood. The persistent mischaracterization of socialism as merely giving money to the poor serves a crucial ideological function for maintaining capitalist hegemony. While social welfare programs do stimulate economic activity by increasing aggregate demand, a well-documented phenomenon in Keynesian economics, the oligarchy's demonization of poverty serves to deflect systematic critique. By framing economic hardship as moral failure rather than structural outcome, the wealthy preserve the fiction of meritocracy while obscuring how capitalism actually functions, as a system where initial conditions of inherited wealth and random privilege determine life outcomes far more than effort or talent. This scapegoating is physiologically necessary for elites. If poverty results from individual shortcomings rather than designed inequality, then the system itself remains blameless and its beneficiaries need not confront their complicity. The relentless conflation of socialism with dependency reveals this defensive posture. When capitalists blame socialism for economic problems, they're engaging in projection, accusing their ideological opposite of the very exploitation they practice. Under capitalism, the largest wealth transfers flow upward through mechanisms like corporate bailouts, tax loopholes, and wage suppression, all while workers produce far more value than they receive. To acknowledge this would expose the system's core contradiction, that it rewards ownership more than labor and inheritance more than innovation. Thus, the myth of the undeserving poor becomes essential. It transforms victims of structural inequality into moral threats, justifying austerity while protecting the real engines of wealth concentration. As sociologist William Domhoff's research demonstrates, this narrative control allows elites to maintain power without overt coercion by ensuring the public never questions why meritocracy somehow always reproduces dynastic wealth. The wealthy don't hate socialism because it helps the poor. They fear it because it reveals their own unearned advantage. In other words, it has to be the poor and socialism's fault because otherwise those in power and the system itself is to blame. The fundamental truth about wealth accumulation in America is that labor alone rarely leads to prosperity. Real wealth comes from capital ownership and investment. The system is structurally designed this way, privileging passive income streams like dividends, royalties, and capital gains, what the government classifies as unearned income, over wages from labor, which are earned income. This dichotomy explains why some on disability can face strict limits on earned income while having no restrictions on investment income. The system incentivizes wealth preservation over work. As Robert Kiyosaki's cash flow quadrant illustrates, true financial freedom comes from building systems that generate income without direct labor, whether through scalable businesses, intellectual property, or financial assets. The capitalist myth of the hard-working millionaire collapses under scrutiny. While the poor must work relentlessly just to survive, the wealthy optimize money's movement through leverage, tax-advantaged structures, and asset appreciation. This reality turns the Fox News narrative of lazy poor people on its head. Poverty in America is brutally labor-intensive, often requiring multiple jobs just to afford basic necessities, while wealth increasingly means detachment from work altogether. When figures like Trump boast about the art of the deal, they're admitting wealth comes from strategic allocation of existing capital, not sweat equity. The system's perversity is most visible in how it treats different income types. Earned income faces higher tax rates and benefit restrictions, while unearned income enjoys preferential treatment. Capital gains taxes top out at 20% compared to 37% for wages, and loopholes like carried interest allow financiers to reclassify labor income as investment income. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where those with capital can compound advantages tax efficiently while workers remain trapped in what sociologists call the precarity trap. Too overworked to build assets, too asset poor to stop working. The result is a nation where wealth has far more to do with leverage and financial engineering than effort, and where those who claim to value hard work have structured the economy to ensure labor alone can never compete with capital. Marx's theory of surplus value reveals the fundamental mechanism of capitalist exploitation. The process is straightforward yet profound. When a business operates, workers produce goods or services worth more than what they're paid in wages. The difference, the surplus value, flows directly to the capital owners without requiring their labor. The capitalist role is purely structural. They provide initial funding for materials, equipment, and wages, then claim the excess value generated by the workers as profit. As Jeff Bezos inadvertently demonstrated when thanking Amazon employees for funding his space ventures through their undercompensated labor, wealth accumulation under capitalism isn't about personal productivity, but about controlling the means of production. A factory owner doesn't become rich by working harder on the assembly line than their employees, but by appropriating the difference between workers' output and their wages. Capitalists extract labor to build wealth. This explains why capital grows exponentially while wages stagnate. The system is designed to funnel productivity gains upward to those who already control assets, not to those whose labor actually creates the value. The brutal irony is that workers simultaneously fund their own exploitation as their underpaid labor hours literally build the fortunes of the people like Bezos while leaving them dependent on those same jobs for survival. The persistent narrative pushed by wealthy celebrities and media figures that people don't want to work fundamentally misunderstands the reality facing most Americans. The issue isn't a lack of work ethic, but rather an economic system where hard work no longer guarantees basic stability. Millions of Americans belong to the working poor, a group that works longer hours than previous generations while falling further behind due to stagnant wages and skyrocketing costs for housing, childcare, education, and essentials. Since 1979, worker productivity has increased by 60%, yet wages have barely budged when adjusted for inflation. Meanwhile, corporate profits have soared to record highs, billionaires have seen their wealth multiply, and the tax code has been systematically rewritten to favor capital over labor. The middle class is disappearing not because people aren't working hard enough, but because the economy has been restructured to extract wealth from workers and funnel it upward. Housing costs have more than doubled relative to income since the 1980s. Childcare consumes nearly 20% of median household earnings in many states, and real wages have failed to keep pace with inflation for decades. This isn't accidental. It's the result of deliberate policy choices, union busting, financial deregulation, corporate tax cuts, and the erosion of worker protections. When politicians and pundits scold struggling Americans for not working harder, they ignore the fact that the system is designed to keep workers exhausted, indebted, and powerless. The cruel irony is that socialism already exists in America, but only for the wealthy. Corporations and billionaires benefit from government subsidies, bailouts, and tax loopholes unavailable to ordinary workers. The 2017 Trump tax cuts alone delivered $1.5 trillion in benefits, overwhelmingly tilted toward the top, while social programs for the poor and middle class face constant austerity demands. When a hedge fund manager pays a lower tax rate than a teacher, when Amazon can make billions in profits and pay zero federal income tax, then banks get bailed out while student debt remains unforgivable, that's the real handout economy. The working class isn't lazy. They're trapped in a rigged system where their labor enriches others while leaving them one missed paycheck away from ruin. If you ever find yourself struggling despite doing everything right, remember, it's not your fault. It's the system working exactly as intended for those at the top. Our current economic system bears striking similarities to what Noam Chomsky has termed industrial feudalism, a structure where corporations function as private tyrannies, wielding control over both production and the workforce. This paradigm has evolved into what sociologists describe as techno-feudalism, where dominant tech conglomerates like Amazon, Google, and Meta have established digital fiefdoms. In this model, users exchange their personal data for access to services, effectively becoming modern-day serfs bound to their digital lords. Despite the promise of upward mobility, many full-time workers find themselves unable to meet basic living expenses, a stark contrast to the post-World War II era. In the 1970s, the federal minimum wage was $2.30 per hour, which, adjusted for inflation, equates to approximately $10.66 in today's dollars. However, the current federal minimum wage remains stagnant at $7.25 per hour. This decline in real wages has made it increasingly difficult for workers to afford necessities such as housing, healthcare, and education. The tax structure has also undergone significant changes. In the 1950s, the top marginal tax rate was as high as 91%, but it has since decreased to 37% in 2025. Moreover, the effective tax rate for the top 0.1% of earners has dropped from 50.6% in the 1950s to 39.8% today. This shift has resulted in a tax system where the wealthiest individuals often pay a lower effective tax rate than the average worker. This disparity is further exacerbated by the preferential treatment of capital gains over labor income. While wages are taxed at rates up to 37%, long-term capital gains are taxed at a minimum of 20%. This incentivizes wealth accumulation through investments rather than labor, perpetuating income inequality. The current economic framework, therefore, mirrors a modern form of feudalism where wealth and power are concentrated among a select few and the majority labor under conditions that offer little opportunity for advancement. Addressing these systematic issues requires a reevaluation of policies related to wages, taxation, and corporate governance to create a more equitable society. The prevailing narrative that hard work alone leads to wealth is increasingly contradicted by the financial strategies employed by the ultra-wealthy. A closer examination of popular investment shows like Shark Tank reveals a consistent mantra among investors: I make my money work for me. This philosophy underscores a fundamental truth in modern capitalism. Sustainable wealth accumulation often stems not from labor, but from capital gains and strategic financial maneuvering. Billionaires such as Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos exemplify this approach. Their vast fortunes are not primarily the result of salaries or wages, but are largely derived from the appreciation of their stock holdings and other investments. For instance, Musk's wealth is predominantly tied to his stakes in companies like Tesla and SpaceX, while Bezos' net worth is largely connected to his shares in Amazon. These forms of income are categorized by the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, as unearned income, distinguishing them from the wages earned through labor. In this way, billionaires don't work for their money. They extract labor value. Moreover, many billionaires strategically minimize their taxable income by opting for low or nominal salaries, thereby reducing their exposure to higher income tax brackets. Instead, they leverage their wealth through investments that yield capital gains, which are often taxed at lower rates than ordinary income. This approach not only amplifies their wealth, but also allows them to legally circumvent higher tax obligations. The implications of this system are profound. While the average worker's income is subject to standard taxation and provides limited avenues for wealth accumulation, the ultra-wealthy benefit from a tax structure that favors investment income. This disparity contributes to widening economic inequality and challenges the notion of a meritocratic society where hard work is the primary driver of financial success. In essence, the current economic framework enables those with substantial capital to exponentially increase their wealth with minimal to no labor input, while the majority of workers continue to exchange their time and effort for comparatively stagnant wages. Addressing this imbalance requires a critical reassessment of tax policies and a commitment to creating a more equitable financial system that rewards labor more fairly. The glaring contradiction in how we treat wealth in America becomes clear when examining capital gains taxation. Billionaires like Elon Musk claim their unrealized gains aren't real money when it comes to paying taxes. Yet somehow, these same unrealized gains magically become real enough to secure billion-dollar loans, as Musk demonstrated when he used his Tesla stock as collateral to buy Twitter. This accounting sleight of hand reveals the fundamental hypocrisy of our system. Wealth exists when the rich need liquidity, but disappears when tax time comes. The business model itself reinforces this inequality. At its core, American capitalism requires just two things: materials and labor. Capitalists provide the materials through their accumulated wealth, while systematically minimizing the labor through automation, outsourcing, and union busting, all to maximize the surplus value extracted from workers. This contrasts sharply with models in many European countries where workers have real power through co-determination systems. In Germany, for instance, large companies must give workers nearly half the seats on supervisory boards, allowing labor to hold management accountable and even remove unperforming CEOs. Such systems recognize that workers create the actual value in an economy and deserve governance rights proportional to their contribution. America's refusal to adopt similar structures isn't an economic necessity, but a political choice, one that maintains the fiction that capital alone deserves control while treating labor as just another input cost to be minimized. The result is a system where productivity gains flow exclusively to shareholders while wages stagnate, where workers have no say in the companies they build, and where billionaires can simultaneously claim poverty to the IRS while leveraging imaginary wealth to consolidate even more power. This isn't free market capitalism, but a rigged game where the rules are written by and for capital owners at everyone else's expense. Addressing systematic economic inequality requires collective action, not just individual effort. Strikes and organized labor movements have historically been effective tools for workers to demand fair wages and better working conditions. By withholding labor, workers can decrease the supply of labor, thereby increasing its demand. This strategy compels employers to negotiate as businesses cannot function without their workforce. Union membership has been shown to reduce income inequality. For instance, unionized workers often earn higher wages and receive better benefits compared to their non-unionized counterparts. Moreover, unions play a crucial role in advocating for policies that promote economic equity. The decline in union membership over recent decades has coincided with a rise in income inequality, highlighting the importance of organized labor in creating a more balanced economy. Organizing a strike involves several key steps: building a strong organizing committee, educating and mobilizing workers, developing clear messaging, and establishing a strike fund to support workers during the strike period. Effective communication and solidarity are essential throughout this process to maintain momentum and achieve desired outcomes. The power dynamics between capitalists and workers underscore the necessity of collective action. While the capitalists rely on workers to generate profits, workers can leverage their collective power to negotiate better terms. Strategies such as reducing workforce participation have been suggested as forms of protest to highlight the reliance of capitalists on labor. Ultimately, organized labor movements and strikes serve as a vital mechanism for challenging economic disparities and advocating for workers' rights. America's tax system has undergone a radical transformation from its progressive roots to its current state of regressive privilege. While we once had a genuinely graduated tax code where the wealthy paid their fair share, decades of lobbying and policy manipulation have inverted this logic. The reality today is stark. Millionaires, often considered extremely wealthy by most standards, actually pay higher effective tax rates than billionaires, while average workers frequently pay higher rates than both. The perverse system means that a teacher or nurse handing over 22 to 24% of their income in taxes often contributes to a greater percentage than a billionaire exploiting loopholes for capital gains, carried interest, and offshore accounts. The distance between financial tiers reveals even more about our broke system. A millionaire is objectively closer to homeless than becoming a billionaire. The wealth gap between 1 million and 1 billion is the same as between 1 and 1,000. Yet the tax code treats these extremes as if they belong to the same class, allowing the ultra-wealthy to exploit legal structures unavailable to mere millionaires or working professionals. This isn't an accident, but a deliberate feature of modern oligarchy. By blurring the lines between the merely affluent and the ultra-rich, the system convinces doctors, lawyers, and small business owners that they share interests with billionaires, when in reality, they are far closer to the working class than they realize. This book will dismantle that illusion. Whether you earn $50,000 or $5 million a year, you are still part of the proletariat in the sense that your livelihood depends on your labor rather than passive capital accumulation. The true dividing line isn't between middle class and rich, but between those who rely on wages and those who live off investments, inheritance, and systematic advantages. The tax code's injustice, where wages are taxed more aggressively than wealth, proves that the game is rigged not for the haves versus the have-nots, but for the have-everythings versus everyone else. Until we recognize this, we'll keep fighting over scraps while the true elites consolidate their control. Economic inequality in the United States has been exacerbated by several structural factors. Union membership has declined significantly from approximately 35% of the workforce in the 1950s to just 10% in recent years, weakening workers' bargaining power and contributing to wage stagnation. Between 1979 and 2019, while productivity increased by nearly 60%, the typical workers' compensation grew by only 16%, indicating a growing disparity between worker output and earnings. The financialization of the economy has prioritized shareholders' returns over employee welfare, and corporate consolidation has reduced competition, often leading to suppressed wages and higher consumer prices. Additionally, monetary policies like quantitative easing have inflated asset prices, benefiting the wealthy, while real wages for workers have remained largely stagnant. To address these disparities, policy proposals have been put forward to reallocate resources more equitably. For example, Senator Elizabeth Warren's plan includes a wealth tax on fortunes over $50 million to fund tuition-free public college and cancel student loan debt. Similarly, implementing a single-payer healthcare system financed through progressive taxation could provide universal coverage and reduce overall healthcare costs. These initiatives aim to ensure that those who benefit most from the economic system contribute proportionally to its sustainability, promoting a more equitable distribution of wealth and resources. Capitalism, in its current form, has increasingly relied on government intervention to sustain itself, contradicting the free market principles it purports to uphold. While proponents often decree socialism as a threat to individual liberty, they overlook how modern capitalism depends on state support to function. Government interventions, such as antitrust enforcement and minimum wage laws, are designed to prevent monopolistic practices and ensure fair labor standards. However, when these measures are weakened or neglected, corporations can exert disproportional influence over policy through lobbying and political contributions, leading to regulatory capture. This dynamic undermines democratic processes and perpetuates economic inequality. A notable example of efforts to curb such influence is the bipartisan initiative led by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to prohibit members of Congress and their families from trading individual stocks. This legislation aims to address conflicts of interest and restore public trust in government by ensuring that lawmakers cannot profit from insider information or policy decisions. The term socialism is often misapplied in political discourse, particularly by critics who label social welfare programs as socialists while ignoring the extensive government support received by large corporations. Corporate welfare, which includes subsidies, tax breaks, and bailouts, cost American taxpayers approximately $100 billion annually. This financial assistance to profitable companies contradicts the notion of a free market economy and exemplifies a system where profits are privatized while risks and losses are socialized. In contrast, social welfare programs designed to assist individuals and families in need often face intense scrutiny and budget cuts. This disparity highlights a fundamental inconsistency in policy priorities, where corporate interests are safeguarded at the expense of broader social equity. Addressing this imbalance requires a reevaluation of government spending and a commitment to policies that promote economic fairness and accountability. The Republican Party's hypocrisy on government assistance reveals their fundamental bad faith. They decree socialism when it helps working people, like stimulus checks or food stamps, while celebrating corporate welfare like PPP loans and fossil fuel subsidies as economic necessities. This double standard isn't an oversight, but a deliberate strategy. By redefining socialism to mean only aid to the poor, they protect the real redistribution of wealth upward. The truth is simple. Republicans oppose helping people, not government spending. Their outrage is reversed for programs that empower workers rather than enrich donors. This pattern of deception, strawman arguments about lazy welfare recipients while quietly approving trillion-dollar corporate bailouts, proves they cannot be trusted to govern in the public interest. The Republican Party exists to serve capital, not citizens. The Republican Party's selective approach to government assistance extends to gun policy, where financial influence from the NRA, National Rifle Association, significantly shapes legislative outcomes. In 2020, the NRA's lobbying expenditures totaled approximately $2.2 million, a figure that underscores its substantial role in opposing gun control measures. This financial clout contributes to the United States' unique position regarding gun violence, particularly mass shootings, which occur at a significantly higher rate compared to other developed nations. Despite this, Republican lawmakers often deflect attention from firearm regulations, attributing school shootings to factors like mental health, video games, or even architectural elements like doors, rather than addressing the accessibility of guns. The pervasive fear of gun violence has tangible effects on American society. For instance, during public events such as 4th of July celebrations, the sound of fireworks can incite panic, as attendees mistake them for gunshots, leading to mass hysteria and evacuations. This environment of fear is a direct consequence of lax gun laws and the political influence wielded by organizations like the NRA. The intersection of political funding and gun policy in the United States illustrates a broader pattern for prioritizing corporate interests over public safety. Addressing this issue requires critical examination of lobbying practices and a commitment to enacting comprehensive gun control measures. Wealthy individuals often utilize charitable organizations to minimize tax liabilities while maintaining control over their assets. By establishing private foundations or contributing to donor-advised funds, DAFs, they can claim substantial tax deductions, sometimes up to 60% of their adjusted gross income, for cash donations and 30% for appreciated assets. These vehicles allow donors to direct funds to causes of their choosing, often with minimal oversight or requirements for timely disbursement. Critics argue that this system enables the affluent to exert disproportionate influence over public priorities, effectively shaping social agendas without democratic input. Moreover, while these philanthropic endeavors provide tax benefits to donors, they may divert resources from public coffers, placing a greater financial burden on average taxpayers. This dynamic underscores concerns about the role of philanthropy in perpetuating economic disparities. By leveraging charitable contributions for personal gain, the wealthy can reinforce existing power structures, often at the expense of broader societal equity. The entrenchment of corporate power in American politics has been strategically reinforced through alliances with Christian nationalist movements, particularly within the Republican Party. Sociologist G. William Domhoff, in his 2021 edition of Who Rules America, elucidates how the corporate elite, comprising the top 1% who control a significant portion of the nation's wealth, have established a power elite that dominates governmental decision-making. This elite utilizes a network of policy planning organizations, think tanks, and lobbying efforts to shape policies that serve their interests, often at the expense of democratic principles. Organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom, ADF, and the Council for National Policy, CNP, exemplify this convergence of corporate interests and Christian nationalism. The ADF, a conservative Christian legal advocacy group, has been instrumental in promoting anti-LGBTQ legislation and opposing reproductive rights, framing these issues within a narrative of religious freedom. Their influence extends to shaping state laws and participating in high-profile court cases, such as the 303 creative lawsuit, which challenged the anti-discrimination protections for LGBTQ individuals. Similarly, the CNP operates as a secretive network that brings together conservative leaders, wealthy donors, and media figures to coordinate strategies that advocate a right-wing agenda. Their activities have included efforts to influence election outcomes and promote policies that align with Christian nationalist ideologies. The integration of these organizations into the political framework has facilitated the propagation of policies that undermine civil liberties and democratic norms. By leveraging religious rhetoric and aligning with corporate interests, they have effectively mobilized support for initiatives that restrict voting rights, suppress minority voices, and erode the suppression of church and state. This strategic alliance underscores the necessity for vigilante defense of democratic institutions and the promotion of inclusive policies that uphold the rights of all citizens. Real Christians do not stand for the inequality, corporate rule, and mistreatment of workers discussed in this book. The hijacking of Christian imagery by today's right-wing movements represents a profound betrayal of Jesus' actual teachings, which championed radical compassion for the poor and marginalized while condemning wealth hoarding and state-sanctioned oppression. Historical accounts depict Jesus as a dissident who challenged both religious and political authorities, healing the sick without payment, driving money changers from the temple, and declaring it easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. In modern terms, his actions, feeding the hungry, sheltering refugees, and rejecting corporate exploitation of faith, would likely see him branded as a socialist or even terrorist by MAGA extremists. The irony is glaring. Those who weaponize crosses against immigrants and LGBTQ individuals worship a version of Christ that bears no resemblance to the historical figure who broke bread with outcasts and forgave sex workers. This distortion isn't accidental, but strategic. Just as Republicans redefined socialism to mean corporate handouts rather than worker empowerment, they've remade Jesus into a mascot for cruelty rather than a model of solidarity. The weaponization of Christianity exposes the movement's bad faith. They invoke morality while opposing living wages, universal health care, and prison reform, policies that would actually fulfill Christ's directive to love thy neighbor. True followers would recognize today's Christian nationalism as the same hypocrisy Jesus denounced when he warned of the wolves in sheep's clothing, authoritarians using religion to sanctify greed and bigotry. The evidence laid bare in this chapter reveals an uncomfortable truth. America's economic and political systems are not broken. They are functioning exactly as designed. From the calculated dismantling of progressive taxation to the corporate capture of democracy, from the suppression of labor to the weaponization of Christianity, the architecture of the modern American life has been engineered to serve capital at the expense of human dignity. The so-called free market is neither free nor fair. It is a rigged game where wealthy begets power and power begets more wealth in a self-perpetuating cycle of extraction. The myth of meritocracy collapses under scrutiny. The wealthy do not become wealthy through hard work alone, but through systems that privilege ownership over labor, inheritance over innovation, and leverage over effort. The tax code, media narratives, and even religious rhetoric have been twisted to justify this inequality, convincing millions to vote against their own interests while the oligarchy consolidates control. The result is a nation where productivity soars but wages stagnate, where corporations receive bailouts while workers face austerity, and where the veneer of democracy masks the reality of corporate rule. Yet history shows that systems built on exploitation are not immutable. The labor movements of the past, the civil rights struggles, and the progressive reforms that once tempered capitalism's excesses prove that change is possible when people organize. The path forward requires more than awareness. It demands collective action. Unions, strikes, and political mobilization remain the most effective tools to challenge entrenched power, just as they were during the New Deal or the Civil Rights era. This is not a call to abandon capitalism entirely, but to reclaim it from the oligarchs who have perverted it into an engine of inequality. The choice before us is stark. Either we accept a future of deepening feudalism where the many serve the few, or we fight for an economy that rewards work over wealth and people over profits. The first step is seeing the system for what it is, not the natural order, but the constructed hierarchy designed to keep us divided, indebted, and docile. The next step is refusing to play by its rules. As Jesus challenged the money changers and Marx exposed surplus value, as unions fought for the 8-hour workday and activists demanded civil rights, the task before this generation is no less monumental. To dismantle the machinery of extraction and rebuild the economy that serves the many, not the few. The oligarchy fears nothing more than an awakened populace. It's time we gave them a reason to be afraid. Afterword. More edutainment at Fiance.com. Thanks for sticking with me until the end. If you made it this far, I hope Farming Humans got you thinking, questioning, and maybe even fired up about the systems that shape our lives in the United States. This book wasn't just about pointing out problems, though there are plenty of those. It was about digging into why things are the way they are, how power, money, and control play out in society, and how we can push back. I'm all about edutainment, mixing education with entertainment to make big ideas hit harder. My music, under the name Fiance, which rhymes with science, defiance, and finance, tackles a lot of the same themes as this book: corporate greed, inequality, and fighting back against the status quo. If you're curious, check out tracks like America in Decline, American Inequality, Capitalism, Luigi Mangiani, and the Corporate Rule and Global Warning albums. My music's just another way to spark the same conversations. In the appendix, you'll find my college degree term paper from 2009. Yes, I got an A on it. It's a deep dive into how ancient Greece thrived by treating individuals like masterpieces, something I think the US could learn from. Consider it a bonus blueprint for building a better society. Farming Humans is my third book, following 108, The Story of Discovering Earth's Consciousness, and Can and Will Do, The Philosophy of Possibility, Determination, and Success. But don't worry, there's more coming, like Dark Racism and Nouveau Economics. I've already snagged the .coms for them, because of course I did. Right now, those URLs just point to my blog at ericleo108.com, but eventually they'll be full-blown hubs for each book, with free resources and premium deep dives, like I have set up for the 108 and Can and Will Do books at knowing.com and canandwilldo.com. Knowing spelled Knhoeing. Want to stay in the loop? All roads lead back to Fience.com, spelled FIENSE.com. My central hub for music, books, and ideas meant to change, inspire, and hopefully entertain. Thanks again for reading. Now go change society for the better. About the author. A voice from the front lines of inequality. Eric Leo is a philosopher, sociologist, and hip-hop artist who doesn't just analyze systematic inequality. He lives its brutal realities every day. Armed with a sociology degree from Eastern Michigan University and creator of hundreds of intellectual properties, Leo represents America's broken promise, a brilliant mind trapped in the disability poverty cycle by design. His life is a case study in how systems harvest labor while crushing opportunity. A direct victim of Reaganomics, Leo has spent years on Section 8 housing wait lists while rationing his work hours to avoid losing health care. Even his acceptance to Western Michigan University's sociology master's program remains out of reach, not due to ability, but because tuition and housing costs act as financial barriers. His schizophrenia presents challenges, but America's rigged system poses greater threats. In his song, American Inequality, Leo raps, "The government exploits my labor power for healthcare," a raw truth about being forced to choose between survival and stability. This isn't academic theory for Leo. It's lived testimony. When he exposes pharmaceutical lobbying or disability traps in Farming Humans, he writes from experience as corporate America's collateral damage. But this book transforms that oppression into fuel for revolution. Farming Humans merges Leo's frontline perspective with devastating data because change requires both truth and proof. His reality, like yours, was engineered by policy choices. Now comes the reckoning. Will we accept exploitation or fight for liberation? The revolution begins when we see the farm for what it is. Leo is tearing down the fences. The work resumes at Fience.com. Come and join the movement to dismantle inequality. This has been Farming Humans, American Inequality and Profit Over People in the Age of Oligarchy. Written and narrated by Eric Leo.